This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people that have so much to gain and have such a material motive to put me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions,
Ooh,
yes.
welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 238. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we are back with part 16 of The Land Belongs to Whom It Belongs. And I think last time we were talking about the 1929 Wailing Wall riots, primarily, right? And today, I think we're gonna explore a slightly ancillary, well, it's not really ancillary, but we're gonna explore an aspect of the 1930s, more on the Zionist side of the ledger. A little bit similarly to our profile of Herzl, right?
You were saying that you had been talking about this book over the past couple of episodes, and you wanted to finally discuss it.
Yes, I've been chomping
So
at the bit.
before we get into the Arab Revolt of 1936, not to be confused with the earlier Arab Revolt, we're going to go into this topic, which is, a pretty interesting one, I think. And one that certainly comes up.
Yeah. I think that, this book that I've been alluding to again and again, Zionism in the Age of the Dictators, by Lenni Brenner, published in, I believe, Australia in 1983, is, I think somebody on Twitter maybe had recommended this to us when we were just starting out this series, like over a year ago. And it is a pretty juicy book in terms of Zionist activities in the 1930s. And while I would say like the primary focus is more about the Zionist movement's relationship with the government of Nazi Germany, naturally Palestine is a huge factor, given that it was the obsessive end goal of pretty much the entire Zionist movement to establish, a Jewish state in Palestine. And I think what I really appreciate about this book is, I think it undercuts a lot of Zionist mythology about the own origins of their movement and the state of Israel, in particular, concerning a very seminal event, the Holocaust of World War II. And I think we've seen, from the creation of Israel right up into the present day and, post October 7th, the invocation of the Nazis and the Holocaust as one of the raison d'etres for why Israel needs to exist. And then also ancillary to that, like we talked about with the Grand Mufti, there's often this almost automatic association with, since the Arabs are fighting, historically enemies of the Zionists, who are Jews, and the Nazis were pretty infamously sworn enemies of all Jews, Zionist or not, and killed millions of them in World War II. There's often an attempt to kind of just lump these two groups together or to imply that they had either, ideological, material connections to one another.
Yes.
I think, and while we did talk about the Grand Mufti and how he did become sort of a PR puppet during World War II when he was in exile, when you start getting into this book, you realize that actually the sort of interactions or the simpatico relationship between say, like Arabs in Palestine and Nazis, well, I wouldn't say there's no context, but I'd say they're greatly dwarfed by the interactions between the leading Zionist organizations and Nazi Germany throughout the 1930s. And the result of their kind of interactions and agreements had huge impacts and actually, like, really, I think, helped lay a lot of the groundwork or, threw a lot of kindling on the simmering fire that would erupt into the Arab Revolt in 1936 because, we're talking about some of the consequences, among other things, like the massive flow of emigration, which, on one level you might be able to surmise was from European Jews fleeing Nazi Germany and seeking refuge in Palestine, right?
Yes,
that's
right.
sort of
like
that's
Dr.
a well-known
Lockman, who we mentioned.
Right. But then there's also agreements that were made, like specifically to facilitate that. It wasn't simply like people fleeing because they knew Palestine was like a safe refuge. I mean, plenty of people fled to the United States and other places as well. But actually, the Zionist, what is less known is the degree to which the Zionists tried to kind of capitalize on Nazi anti-Semitic policies, and restrictions and things like that, and use that to their advantage. Because I think we've mentioned this before, there is this like uncomfortable alignment of interests with like interwar Zionists and Nazis, in that the Nazis want the Jews to go away, and the Zionists also want the Jews to go away for different reasons, to be sure.
Yeah, we've definitely mentioned it before because this is kind of like Norm Finkelstein's whole thing, like how he came up was sort of paying attention to the sort of industry around the Holocaust and the discursive power, the way the Holocaust is deployed discursively in Zionist rhetoric, right? And you don't need someone to point that out to you. Like, it's obvious. Like, you can even see like IDF soldiers like being like, look, I found a copy of Mein Kampf in this like demolished wreckage of a home or something. And like anyone who has ever had a conversation about Israel, it doesn't get very far before the Holocaust comes up in terms of like justifying its existence. That's almost what I think we can see in the series, if you've been listening to it through these 16 parts, that the whole idea that Israel exists because the Holocaust happened, definitely you're right, that it facilitated it, right? But, and that it became a justification for it, as we talked about, in our discussion of the Grand Mufti's career and things like that. But certainly, like, before the Holocaust happened, the writing was already very much on the wall, and the vision of Israel was very underway in terms of being realized. Yeah.
And the deals that were struck between Zionists and the Nazi government like actually helped really materially lay the groundwork for the establishment of Israel, even putting aside all the consequences of the Holocaust in World War II. Like, even up through 1939, it had already affected, and even aside from general like Kristallnacht persecution of that kind, though of course it's all related, but the Zionists made great effort to sort of like reap the whirlwind of like German Nazi anti-Semitism and kind of like spin it to their advantage in building their own state. And in some cases, as this book kind of outlines pretty well, at various points led to sort of Zionist organizations not taking the kind of strong anti-Nazi stance that you might expect them to take in the 1930s, right?
Right.
Which is not to say there was not a lot of international Jewish opposition to Hitler. There was. But among the Zionists specifically, they do not come off super great in the account of, the great anti-fascist struggle of the 30s. Because their eye was on a different prize in a way. And it might be good. I think Brenner lays out early on in this book the sort of, I think we've touched on it before, talking about Herzl, about how like this kind of presumption of anti-Semitism being just like eternal and like an unchangeable fact of European life and stuff, like leads to some strange, like if you follow that logic, it leads to some strange synchronicities with like the very right-wing like anti-Semitic forces that are kind of on the rise. So I think from early on here on page 22, there's a little section. She goes over World War I and Balfour and everything. This section, Zionist accommodation with anti-Semitism, lays a little groundwork here. So I'll just read this real quick. Brenner writes that the essentials of Zionist doctrine on anti-Semitism were laid down well before the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism was inevitable and could not be fought. The solution was the emigration of unwanted Jews to a Jewish state in the making. The inability of the Zionist government to take Palestine militarily compelled it to look for imperial patronage, which it expected to be motivated by anti-Semitism to some degree. Zionists additionally saw revolutionary Marxism as an assimilationist enemy, which persuaded them to ally against it with their fellow separatists of the anti-Semitic right-wing nationalist movements in Eastern Europe. Herzl and his successors were proven correct. It was an anti-Semite, Balfour, who enabled Zionism to entrench itself in Palestine. Although Israel was ultimately established through armed revolt against Britain, if it had not been for the presence of the British Army during the early years of the Mandate, the Palestinians would have not had the slightest problem pushing Zionism out. But we are victims here of a sleight of hand trick. Balfour did give Zionism its toehold in Palestine, but did the British Mandate protect the Jews against their enemies in Europe? Anti-Semitism could always be fought. It was not only fought, it was defeated in France, Russia, and the Ukraine without any help from the World Zionist Organization. Had the people of those countries followed the dictates of the Zionists, the anti-Semites would never have been defeated. The policies of the early WZO, World Zionist Organization, were continued in all essentials by Chaim Weizmann, the main leader of the organization during the Hitler epoch. Those elements in the WZO who wanted to make a stand against Nazism in the 1930s always found their main internal enemy in the president of their own movement. Nahum Goldman, himself to become a post-Holocaust president of the WZO, later described in a speech the fierce arguments on the subject between Weizmann and Rabbi Stephen Weisse, a leading figure in American Zionism. Quote, I remember very violent discussions between him and Weizmann, who was a very great leader in his own right, but who rejected every interest in other things. He did take an interest in saving German Jews in the period of the first years of Nazism, but World Jewish Congress, Fight for Jewish Rights, not that he denied their need, but he could not spare the time from his Zionist work. Stephen Weisse argued with him, quote, but it is part and parcel of the same problem. If you lose the Jewish diaspora, you will not have a Palestine, and you can only deal with the totality of Jewish life. Such was Zionism and such its leading figure when Adolf Hitler strode onto the stage of history. Yeah, so the next chapter's got some interesting stuff. It's called Blut und Boden, Blood and Soil, the Roots of Zionist Racism. There's a lot here that, shows the kind of racism of various, Zionist leaders and also the influence that the sort of like German romanticism, nationalism kind of movements of the time had on them, right? Mm-hmm. And they talk about the German.
This talks about some interesting people like Max Nordau. It is interesting, like that, his kind of intellectual influence on a lot of the trends you saw in Nazism. But anyway,
they talk about von der Vogels, and that kind of movement, and they say that the German university graduates who took over the Zionist movement after Herzl's death developed the modernist racist ideology of Jewish separatism. They had been powerfully influenced by their pan-Germanic fellow students of the Wandervogel, wandering birds or free spirits, who dominated the German campuses before 1914, kind of the original Psytrance people, in a way. These chauvinists rejected the Jews as not being of Germanic Blut. Therefore, they could never be part of the German Volk, and were thoroughly alien to the Teutonic Boden or soil. All Jewish students were compelled to grapple with these concepts which surrounded them. A few moved left and joined the Social Democrats. To them, this was just more bourgeois nationalism and was to be fought as such. Most remained conventionally Kaiser-true, stout nationalists. Kaiser-true. Stout nationalists who insisted that 1,000 years in the German Boden had made them into Germans of the Mosaic persuasion. But a portion of the Jewish students adopted the Wandervogel ideology whole and simply translated it into Zionist terminology. They agreed with the anti-Semites on several key points. The Jews were not part of the German Volk, and of course, Jews and Germans should not mix sexually, not for the traditional religious reasons, but for the sake of their own unique Blut. Not being of Teutonic Blut, they perforce had to have their own Boden, Palestine. And this is interesting. At first glance, it would appear strange that middle-class Jewish students should be so influenced by anti-Semitic thought, especially as at the same time, socialism, with its assimilationist attitudes towards the Jews, was gaining considerable support in the society around them. However, socialism appealed primarily to the workers, not to the middle class. In their environment, chauvinism predominated. Although intellectually they repudiated their connection with the German people, in fact they never emancipated themselves from the German capitalist class, and throughout the First World War the German Zionists passionately supported their own government. For all their grandiose intellectual pretensions, their Volkisch Zionism was simply an imitation of German nationalist ideology. Yeah, so I guess, they all stand, they're all Kaiser true. They kind of are, let's see, who do they talk about here? Buber. They talk about, who's this author? Martin Buber was the first to combine Zionism with ardent German patriotism during World War I in Drei Reden über das Judentum, which I guess got into some mystical kind of nationalist type of shit, which is not super popular, but they say what was needed was a popular Zionist version of the social Darwinism, which had swept the bourgeois intellectual world in the wake of Europe's imperial conquests in Africa and the East. The Zionist version of this notion was developed by the Austrian anthropologist Ignaz Zolschan. To him, the secret value of Judaism was that it had, albeit inadvertently, worked to produce a wonder of wonders, quote, a nation of pure blood, not tainted by diseases of excess or immorality, of a highly developed sense of family purity, and of deeply rooted virtuous habits, would develop an exceptional intellectual activity. Furthermore, the prohibition against mixed marriage provided that these highest ethnical treasures should not be lost through the admixture of less carefully bred races. There resulted that natural selection, which has no parallel in the history of the human race. If a race that is so highly gifted were to have the opportunity of again developing its original power, nothing could equal it as far as cultural value is concerned. And then this, you kind of hate to see this, even Albert Einstein subscribed to the Zionist race conceptions, and in so doing, he reinforced racism, lending it the prestige of his reputation. His own contributions to the discussion sound suitably profound, but they are based in the same nonsense. This is Einstein, quote, nations of the racial difference appear to have instincts which work against their fusion. The assimilation of the Jews to the European nations could not eradicate the feeling of lack of kinship between them and those among whom they lived. In the last resort, the instinctive feeling of lack of kinship is referable to the law of the conservation of energy. For this reason, it cannot be eradicated by any amount of well-meant pressure. Wow, what a serious scientist. Damn. So there was a lot of, the race purity thing was just as kind of, prevalent in Zionist, thought as it was in some of these others in the 20s and 30s. This is a weird quote from... Let's see, Maurice Samuel.
People think this way today, absolutely.
Right.
Maybe not like openly about Jews. I mean, I think this reminds me a lot of what Elon was saying about how Japan needs to stay Japan. Cultures need to. It just is how it is.
As an intergenerational eugenicist, he would know.
Yes.
He wouldn't be familiar with this line of thought. And every weird blue check account on X these days loves talking about this race IQ. These race IQ parlor games and essentialism and the admixtures of, I saw I saw the other day that there's this whole, apparently there's a study from Iceland that proves that marrying your third cousin is genetically optimal or something like that, and it's the sweet spot between anything closer could be
what does optimal mean?
For isolating in this kind of eugenics mindset, they think it's genetically optimal in that it
I guess that
reinforces it gets rid of bad recessive genes
exactly
enough,
I get it making sure that your offspring are as homogenous as possible within a family line. I guess that makes sense, but
which is honestly the old
minimizing
New England...
the risk of genetic disorders and things like that.
I mean, honestly, that's that's probably lots of ruling classes throughout history have probably followed a similar like mating strategy. Certainly, I'd say like the American Northeastern ruling class, there's so much like third cousin marriage, which is why they're all kind of like vaguely related to each other.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, cousin
you know,
marriage historically isn't such an unusual thing.
No, you're right. You're right.
Like,
yeah.
especially globally.
Right.
But,
And more
you know,
isolated
like
rural
the idea
areas.
of like genetically optimal is what's bizarre. Like it's just completely arbitrary.
Right. Well, that's why I mean, like, when it gets to the upper classes, they're the ones that tend to be more obsessed with like the bloodline and like, you know, this kind of like weird shit about like the what kind of family are you breeding with, you know, kind of thing.
Right.
And so yeah, I mean, look at Roosevelt. Like, yeah, married his fourth cousin, you know, a little less than optimal. But no, it's like that kind of like simplistic race science. I mean, that was basically, you know, it has not gone away, unfortunately, today. But even Einstein, who was kind of like a heckin' socialist in a lot of ways, and I guess to be slightly fair, he did, I think, speak out against kind of around the time of the Nakba and like the creation of Israel, like after World War II. He write some open letter that warned that a lot of these, like the Haganah and like these different groups were basically like the same as like Mussolini's fascists and, you know, and stuff like that. Like he was like a liberal class, almost like a classic like liberal Zionist of like, wait a minute, that's too far. But like he kind of agrees with the presumptions.
Yeah,
Hannah Arendt too.
Yeah.
Who, you know, was in love with a Nazi. So
that open letters in the New York Times you're talking about, what Hannah Arendt also signed, and
that correct. Signed, and there's a funny line here from the American author Brenner says that for sheer fanaticism, few could match the American Maurice Samuel, who's a well-known writer, and he published a novel in 1927 called I, the Jew. He denounced with horror a town which he readily conceded he'd only knew by repute, and that the evidence would make us think was the free-living artist colony at Taos, New Mexico. Interesting. He says about Taos, there came together into this small place representatives of the African Negro, the American and Chinese Mongol, the Semite and the Aryan. Free intermarriage had set in. Why does this picture, part actual, part fanciful, fill me with a strange loathing, suggest the obscene, the obscurely beastly? Why then does that village, which my fancy conjures up, call to mind a heap of reptiles breeding uglily in a bucket? Okay, like, that was, I guess, you know, a normal Zionist sentiment at the time. Kind of anti-hippie, yeah, a little bit. So, you know, more about Bluten Boden and...
Talk about hell in a bucket, yeah.
Yeah, talking hell in a bucket. And also the kind of, like, there is a kind of weird, like, Jewish self-hatred, like, anti-Semitism permeating a lot of this writing.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this definitely in past episodes. Like, if you look at those early, like, Zionist, like, propaganda posters for, like, promoting immigration to Israel, or Aliyah, or whatever, like, they call it, like, the posters are always these Aryan, like blonde-haired, blue-eyed, like muscular supermen, like plowing the desert and things like that. It's Right. Yeah, like the way, I mean, the Mauschel. We talked about the Mauschel. Yeah, a lot of this is like the kind of Herzl stuff. Yeah, you know.
I don't know how to pronounce this, but like the Shelalat Hagalut, the negation of the diaspora, which is which basically is something that I think a lot of Zionists like clung to as and argued vigorously for in the end, at times bleeding almost over into like an open hostility to like the entire Jewish people. They cite one group, I think a German organization, Hashemer Hatzer, the Young Watchmen, and this was written in 1917, published in 1936 as a youth organization. One quote from their, pamphlet was, the Jew is a caricature of a normal, natural human being, both physically and spiritually. As an individual in society, he revolts and throws off the harness of social obligations, knows no order nor discipline. So, you know, they say that, you know, anyone reading these pieces without knowing their source would have automatically assumed that they came from the anti-Semitic press. The style of Jewish self-hatred, blah, 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 permeated. Here's a wild thing. The same author, Maurice Samuel, in the 1924 work, You Gentiles, he fabricated a Jewry driven by its own sinister demiurge to oppose the Christian social order. Quote, We Jews, we the destroyers, will remain the destroyers forever. Nothing that you will do will meet our needs and demands. We will forever destroy because we need a world of our own, a God world, which is not your nature to build. Those of us who fail to understand that truth will always be found in alliance with your rebellious factions until disillusionment comes. The wretched fate which scattered us through your midst has thrust this unwelcome role upon us. Like, I mean, this sounds like, like a Nazi screenplay about, like, a villainous Jew that is, like, confessing his plan for world domination, basically. But that was written by a fanatical Zionist American author. And so, yeah, like, kind of a strange, thing going on there. And, talk about labor Zionism, had its own kind of thing. This section, grist to the mills of Nazi propaganda. Brenner makes the point that if, without further facts, anyone were told that the early Zionists were racist, it would be automatic to assume this to be a part of the colonialist aspects of Zionism in Palestine. This is interesting. In reality, this is not so. Blut Zionism would have evolved even if Palestine were to have been completely empty. Enthusiasm for Blut und Boden were part of Zionism before the first modern Zionist ever left Europe. Race Zionism was a curious offshoot of racial anti-Semitism. True, these Zionists argued, the Jews were a pure race, certainly purer than, say, the Germans, who, even as the Pan-Germanics conceded, had a huge admixture of Slavic blood. But to these Zionists, even their racial purity could not overcome the one flaw in Jewish existence. They did not have their own Jewish Boden. If the Teutonic racists could see themselves as Übermenschen, these Hebrew racists did not see the Jews in that light. Rather, it was the reverse. They believed that because they lacked their own Boden, the Jews were Untermenschen, and therefore, for their, quote, hosts, little more than leeches, the world pest. If one believes in the validity of racial exclusiveness, it is difficult to object to anyone else's racism. If one believes further that it is impossible for any people to be healthy except in their own homeland, then one cannot object to anyone else excluding, quote, aliens from their territory. In fact, the average Zionist never thought of himself as leaving civilized Europe for the wilds of Palestine. In life, it is obvious that Zionist Blut und Boden provided an excellent rationale for not fighting anti-Semitism on its home ground. It was not the fault of the anti-Semites. It was because of the Jews' own misfortune of being in exile. The Zionists could tearfully argue that the loss of Palestine was the root cause of anti-Semitism, and the regaining of Palestine was the only solution to the Jewish question. Everything else could only be palliative or futile. Yeah, and I guess the last part here. Walter Lacour, the doyen of Zionist historians, has asked in his book, A History of Zionism, if Zionist insistence on the naturalness of anti-Semitism was not just, quote, grist to the mill of Nazi propaganda. It certainly was. Lacour's question can best be answered with another question. Is it difficult to understand the gullible reader of a Nazi newspaper who concluded that what was said by the Nazis and agreed to by the Zionists, Jews, had to be right? There would be worse. Any Jewish movement that prattled on about the naturalness of anti-Semitism would, just as, quote, naturally, seek to come to terms with the Nazis when they came to power.
Have you ever heard of this guy, Otto Weininger? He's an Austrian guy. He was Jewish, but he was basically a huge, like, self-hating Jew in the way that, like, a lot of these people who we've been talking about were to some extent, like, I mean, maybe not self-hating, but they definitely had, like, anti-Semitic ideas about, or bought into anti-Semitic ideas about, like, Jews who didn't agree with them or share their view of Jewishness or things like that. But, yeah, this guy actually was kind of an influence on some Nazi propaganda, I think. Like, some of his writings were used by the Nazis. In fact, I'm reading his Wikipedia article right now. In his private conversations, Hitler recalled a remark his mentor, Dietrich Eckart, made about Weininger. I only knew one decent Jew, and he committed suicide in the day when he realized that the Jew lives upon the decay of peoples. Because this guy, had killed himself. But yeah,
wow.
So that's another, example. This is a quote from him. Our age is not only the most Jewish, but also the most effeminate of all ages, an age in which art only provides a sudarium for its moods, and which has derived the artistic urge in humans from the games played by animals, an age of the most credulous anarchism, an age without any appreciation of the state and law, an age of species ethics, an age of the shallowest of all imaginable interpretations of history, referring to historical materialism, the age of capitalism, an age of capitalism and Marxism, an age for which history, life, science, everything has become nothing but economics and technology, an age that has declared genius to be a form of madness, but which no longer has one great artist or one great philosopher, an age that is most devoid of originality, but which chases most frantically after originality, an age that has replaced the idea of virginity with the cult of demi-vierge. This age has also the distinction of being the first to have not only affirmed and worshipped sexual intercourse, but to have practically made it a duty, not as a way of achieving oblivion, as the Romans or Greeks did in their bacchanals, but in order to find itself and to give its own dreariness a meaning. That literally sounds like something that you would see on X. Like, word for word. Like, posted tomorrow, like in English. That just struck me as
Greek
I was reading
statue
this,
avatar.
I didn't plan on making that comment before I read that quote. I just wanted to give an example of some of his ideas. But as I was reading it, I was like, wow. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it's this is pretty rife. Like, I mean, I think to call it like race Zionism is like not, too far off the mark. Like, and kind of agreeing with like the suppositions of Nazi ideology and kind of this is the era of kind of peak eugenics hysteria and enthusiasm, in Europe and the United States.
Yeah,
and
if you like both people like Weininger and like Wagner, who we mentioned before, like they basically use like Jewishness as, and Marx did the same thing, kind of used Jewishness as sort of an intellectual term that was almost like, it's not really, if you're honest about it, but like abstracted from the people themselves. Like, Weininger, he's Jewish, but he could get away from Jewishness, although I guess in the end he calculated that he couldn't. Hence his suicide, but like in Marx's essay on the Jewish question, the defense of that, which I think is kind of, he's a man of his time. You got to be honest about it, like, but the defense of that would be that it's like an abstract thing, but you can see how that use of Judaism as kind of this abstracted negative force is not like a positive aspect of intellectual life to participate in and promote, which, everyone kind of was, both Jews and non-Jews. Not everyone, but, people, both Jews and non-Jews were.
It's potentially dangerous.
Definitely.
Thing to play around with.
And it certainly like stokes anti-Semitism. It's and hatred.
I'm trying to think of that auto figure might pop up. There's a few people that kind of just go like full fascism and even to some extent like collaborate with Nazi Germany to some degree.
Yeah, I searched him in this book. I didn't find him, but I think that he was a little bit earlier because he might have been in the early 20th century.
But also another vector of collaboration that I think was very significant and actually had a lot more adherents was Mussolini's Italy, which is what Chapter 4 is about. And I think it's interesting that throughout the course of the 1930s that Mussolini had on his payroll and was kind of cultivating at various times Ante Pavelic, like the ultra-right-wing fascist Catholic, Croatian terrorist, al-Husseini at some point, right? The Dogram Mufti himself, and also many Zionists who, I think it's kind of well known that Mussolini wasn't as obsessively, proactively anti-Semitic as the Nazis were, right? And ended up basically, going along with it, for which he's rightfully judged, but like wasn't exactly his first, he was a reactionary, he was a fascist, et cetera, but he always had an idea of like, oh, well, we can like work with the Jews or, prominent Jews or whatever. And kind of basically this chapter gets into it. I think it's very interesting because they really, like a lot of the Zionists like really fuck with Mussolini and like love him. So yeah, in Chapter 4, Zionism and Italian Fascism, 1922 to 1933, Brenner says that the WZO's attitude toward Italian fascism was determined by one criterion: Italy's position on Zionism. When Mussolini was hostile to them, Weizmann was critical of him, but when he became pro-Zionist, the Zionist leadership enthusiastically supported him. On the day Hitler came to power, they were already friends with the first fascist leader. As a revolutionary, Mussolini had always worked with Jews in the Italian Socialist Party, and it was not until he abandoned the left that he first began to echo the anti-Semitic ideas of the Northern European right wing. 4 days after the Bolsheviks took power, he announced that their victory was a result of the plot between the, quote, synagogue, that is, Seyerbaum, Lenin, Seyerbaum, I guess is his name for Lenin, Bronstein, Trotsky, and the German army. Wow, he's like talking about the cathedral. It sounds like, the synagogue is taken over. By 1919, he has communism explained. The Jewish bankers, Rothschild, Vomberg, Schiff, and Guggenheim, were behind the communist Jews. But Mussolini was not so anti-Semitic as to exclude Jews from his new party, and there were 5 among the founders of the fascist movement. Nor was anti-Semitism important to his ideology. In fact, it was not well received by his followers. Anti-Semitism in Italy had always been identified in the public mind with Catholic obscurantism. It was the church which had forced the Jews into the ghettos, and Italian nationalists had always supported the Jews against the popes, whom they saw as opponents of a unified Italy. In 1848, the walls of the Roman ghetto were destroyed by the revolutionary Roman Republic. With their defeat, the ghetto was restored, but the final victory of the nationalist Kingdom of Italy in 1870 brought an end to discrimination against the Jews. The church blamed the Jews for the nationalist victory, and the official Jesuit organ, Civiltà Cattolica, continued to insist that they'd only been defeated by, quote, conspiracies with the Jews that were formed by Mazzini, Garibaldi, Cavour, Farini, and De Predis. But this clerical ranting against the heroes of Italian nationalism merely discredited anti-Semitism, particularly among the anti-clerical youth, the nationalist petty bourgeoisie. Since the essence of fascism was the mobilization of the middle class against Marxism, Mussolini listened carefully to his followers' objections. What was the point of denouncing communism as a Jewish conspiracy if the Jews themselves were not unpopular? Yeah, so I guess Mussolini originally combined anti-Semitism with pro-Zionism, and his Popolo d'Italia continued to favor Zionism until 1919, until he concluded that it was merely a cat's paw for the British, and he began to refer to the local Zionist movement as, quote, so-called Italians. So they were a little, I guess, suspicious of Zionism, including Jewish members of the Italian government. The Italian line on Palestine was that Protestant Britain had no real standing in the country as there were no native Protestants there. All right. That's slightly better than the British position. What they wanted in Palestine was an international Holy Land. In agreeing with the position of the pre-fascist governments on Palestine and Zionism, Mussolini was primarily motivated by imperial rivalry with Britain and by hostility to any political grouping in Italy having a loyalty to an international movement. So, yeah, he did think it was kind of a tool of the British. He met a delegation, I think, after his march on Rome in 1922, but they pledged, they assured the Duce of their loyalty in December 1922. When they obtained an audience with him, and, insisted that they were not a cat's paw of the British. And then going down here, Weizmann really, never mobilized opposition to Mussolini, but only, yelled at them when they, talk shit about Zionism, basically. That's it. Then their Italian policy changed in the mid-20s when their consuls in Palestine concluded that Zionism was there to stay and that Britain would only leave the country if and when the Zionists got their own state. Weizmann was invited back to Rome for a conference in 1926. Mussolini was more than cordial. He offered to help the Zionists build up their economy, and the fascist press began printing favorable articles on Palestinian Zionism. So Zionist leaders began to visit Rome. This is interesting. Michael Ledeen, a specialist on fascism and the Jewish question, has described the political outcome of the Nahum Sokolow Mussolini talks in 1927. Michael Ledeen, the neocon, deep state guy, I guess. I guess he's a specialist on fascism, you could say. He's the guy who wrote books with Michael Flynn and is an insane Zionist neocon government guy going back to the 70s and 80s. But I guess he described this meeting. With this last meeting, Mussolini became lionized by Zionism. Sokolow not only praised the Italian as a human being, but announced his firm belief that fascism was immune from anti-Semitic preconceptions. He went even further. In the past, there might have been uncertainty about the true nature of fascism, but now, quote, we began to understand its true nature. True Jews have never fought against you. These words, tantamount to a Zionist endorsement of the fascist regime, were echoed in Jewish periodicals all over the world. In this period, which saw a new legal relationship established between the Jewish community and the fascist state, expressions of loyalty and affection for fascism poured out of the Jewish centers of Italy. Now, some of the labor Zionists in Italy did not like these remarks because they were kind of affiliated with the underground Italian Socialist Party because they were part of the Socialist International. And they complained, but overall the Italian Zionists were overjoyed. Prosperous and extremely religious, these conservatives saw Mussolini as their support against Marxism and its concomitant assimilation. In 1927, Rabbi Sacerdoti gave an interview to the journalist Guido Berarida. He said, Professor Sacerdoti is persuaded that many of the fundamental principles of the fascist doctrine, such as the observance of the laws of the state, respect of traditions, the principle of authority, exaltation of religious values, a desire for the moral and physical cleanliness of family and the individual, the struggle for an increase of production, and therefore a struggle against Malthusianism, are no more or less than Jewish principles. Okay. Struggle against Malthusianism.
Interestingly, it actually kind of seems like, as kind of a sidebar here, that Michael Ledeen is sort of a modern day case study in a lot of what you're talking about, because it does seem actually that his early work was mostly on Italian fascism, but like kind of from a sympathetic perspective. Or at least,
he's a name that pops up a lot around like Gladio discussions. Honestly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah.
And, he co-wrote a book with Renzo Di Felice, who is, like, known as, like, kind of a fascist sympathetic historian of Italian fascism in particular. So, he co-wrote a book with him called Fascism, an informal introduction to its theory and practice. Then, he wrote a book about Renzo Di Felice and the controversy over Italian fascism, about his co-author and kind of his controversial work. Yeah, and then subsequently, he got into kind of writing a lot about Iran. And, was kind of like a real anti-Iran hardliner.
Yes, very much so.
And, aggressively sort of pro-Israel voice.
Honestly,
well.
I think one day we should do a whole episode just on Michael Ledeen, because I'm just going back over his Wikipedia. He's involved in so much shit. First of all, he, like, speaking of Gladio, he did like freelance work for SISMI, the Italian intelligence services, receiving over $100,000 from them from offshore bank accounts for including but not limited to training Italian intelligence operatives. And so, like, that's very Gladio. He was involved in Billygate in Libya with Billy Carter. He, I believe, was involved in pushing the Bulgarian connection thing. Another thing we have to get to one day. The, the Grey Wolves attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II.
Yeah.
He was involved. He was actually working with Italian military intelligence in 1980.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
and then people
speculate that he forged Italian intelligence documents as part of like the Yellow Cake uranium forgery scandal that happened in 2001. You remember that?
Right, he did the Yellow Cake Africa thing after 9/11. He was involved with Arnaud de Borchgrave and Claire Sterling and like the Washington Times, Susslords, and CSIS at Georgetown. That Pritzker-run think tank.
Iran
he was a scholar
Contra,
there.
of course.
Iran-Contra, he worked under Bob McFarlane. He met with Shimon Peres and like brokered CIA meetings between Israelis, Hezbollah hostage negotiations. Yeah, I love that he knew Adnan Khashoggi. There's a lot. Iraq War advocacy. I think he might have actually been profiled in Adam Curtis's The Power of Nightmares from the 2000s. I think he's like as a kind of neocon suslord, though I haven't watched that in years. I feel like it's probably a little limited hangouty, but yeah, about as certainly an expert on Italian fascism, I think we can say.
Yes, I definitely would say. Yeah, he's an expert.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not only the next, he actually has a doctorate in history and philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
He does, yeah. Not
your
quite alma
longtime
mater.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I see he's a writer for Tablet Magazine as well. Interesting.
Yeah, and the New Republic, of course, at one point.
And the New Republic.
Yeah.
He wrote an article called "Amid Rising Anti-Semitism in Western Europe, Italian Jews are staging a surprising revival." This is from 2014. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, interesting. Anyways, so basically some of these guys are like, some of these Zionists in Italy are really cozying up to fascism and being like, actually, this really fucks with us and like whatever. But then Hitler comes around and things do get more complicated because like Hitler does not hide that, it's all about the Jews for him. Yeah. So in 1926 in Mein Kampf, Hitler declared that in his heart of hearts, the Italian was an anti-Semite. This is a quote here where, this is Hitler speaking. The struggle that all caps fascist Italy is waging, though perhaps in the last analysis unconsciously, which I personally do not believe, against the three main weapons of the Jews is the best indication that, even though indirectly, the poison fangs of this supra-state power are being torn out. The prohibition on Masonic secret societies, the persecution of the supranational press, as well as the continued demolition of international Marxism, and conversely, the steady reinforcement of the fascist state conception, will in the course of the years cause the Italian government to serve the interests of the Italian people more and more, without regard for the hissing of the Jewish world hydra. Okay. Yeah, I know. So
The Jewish world hydra.
Yeah, the Jewish world hydra. But Mussolini did kind of like push back a little bit, like in the late 1920s, against Hitler's Nordic racism and anti-Semitism. And so they, the Nazis were kind of like, no, he's our guy. Like, let's just hold out and hope that, like, he has to say that, which eventually, he did go along with it. So, yeah, there was actually like a kind of move early on by some Italian fascists to sort of say that Italian fascism is like the true authentic fascism, and Hitler is kind of like a deviationist, and he's like a pseudo-fascist kind of thing, right? But then that was in like 1932, but then quickly, I think that line of attack, like Mussolini starts to sort of have to kiss up to Hitler. Chapter 5 here, this is the key chapter. German Zionism offers to collaborate with Nazism. So there was this party, the ZVFD, which is like the Zionist political party or organization in Germany at the time, which Brenner says politically adapted their theories and policies to the Nazi regime when it came in. Yeah, some of them thought that they could induce the Nazis to support them, and so the ZVFD solicited the patronage of Adolf Hitler not once but repeatedly after 1933. The goal of the ZVFD became an orderly retreat, that is, Nazi backing for emigration of at least the younger generation of Jews to Palestine, and they immediately sought contact with elements in the Nazi apparatus whom they thought would be interested in such an arrangement on the basis of a Volkisch appreciation of Zionism. Kurt Tuchler, a member of the ZVFD executive, persuaded Baron Leopold its elder von Mildenstein of the SS to write a pro-Zionist piece for the Nazi press. The Baron agreed on the condition that he visited Palestine first, and 2 months after Hitler came to power, the two men and their wives went to Palestine. Von Mildenstein stayed there for 6 months before he returned to write his articles. Contact with a central figure in the new government came in March 1933, when Hermann Goering summoned the leaders of the major Jewish organizations. In early March, Julius Streicher, the editor of Der Stürmer, had declared that, as of April 1st, all Jewish stores and professionals would be boycotted. However, this campaign ran into an immediate snag. Hitler's capitalist backers were extremely worried by the announcement by Rabbi Weisse in America of a planned counter-demonstration to be held in New York on March 27th if the Nazis went ahead with their boycott. Jews were prominent throughout the retail trade, both in America and Europe, and, fearing retaliation against their own companies, Hitler's wealthy patrons urged him to call off the action. But the Nazis could hardly do that without losing face, and they decided to use German Jewry to head off Weisse. Thus, Hermann Goering called in the Jewish leaders. German Zionism's influence in Weimar Germany did not merit its leaders' participation, but because they conceived themselves as the only natural negotiating partner with the Nazis, they secured a late invitation. Martin Rosenbluth, a leading Zionist, later told of the incident in his post-war autobiography, Go Forth and Serve. 4 Jews saw Goering: Julius Brodnitz for the CV, Heinrich Stahl for the Berlin Jewish community, Max Naumann, a pro-Nazi fanatic from the Verband Nationaldeutscher Juden, the VNJ, and Blumenfeld for the Zionists. Goering launched into a tirade. The foreign press was lying about atrocities against Jews. Unless the lies stopped, he could not vouch for the safety of German Jewry. Most important, the New York rally had to be called off. Quote, Dr. Weisse is one of our most dangerous and unscrupulous enemies. A delegation was to go to London to contact world Jewry. The assimilationists declined, claiming that as Germans they had no influence with foreign Jews. This was false, but they hardly wanted to assist in their own destruction. Only Blumenfeld volunteered, but insisted he be allowed to speak truthfully about the Nazi treatment of Jews. Goering did not care what was said to get the rally called off. Perhaps a description of the grim situation might make foreign Jews halt for fear of provoking worse. He did not care who went or what arguments were used, as long as the deputation agreed to, quote, report regularly to the German embassy. The ZVFD finally sent Martin Rosenbluth and Richard Lichtheim. Fearing exclusive responsibility for the outcome of their strange mission, they prevailed upon the CV to let them take along Dr. Ludwig Tietz. Although not a Zionist personally, the wealthy businessman was, quote, a good friend of ours. The trio arrived in London on March 27th and immediately met 40 Jewish leaders at a meeting chaired by Nahum Sokolow, then president of the WZO. They later met a battery of British officials. The delegates saw 2 tasks before them: to use the severity of the situation to promote Palestine as, quote, the logical place of refuge, and to head off all anti-Nazi efforts abroad. They called Weisse in New York. Rosenbluth described the incident thus in his memoirs, quote, mindful of Goering's charges, we conveyed the message. Getting the cryptic rest of our message across to him was somewhat more difficult, since it was necessary to speak in obscure terms in order to confound any possible monitors. Subsequent events proved we had made clear our hidden plea, and that Dr. Weisse had understood we wanted him to stand firm and under no circumstances cancel the meeting. There is no evidence that any effort was made to signal Weisse to this effect. Through the research of an Israeli scholar, Shaul Esch, it is now known that the deputation tried to head off demonstrations in New York and Palestine. According to Esch, later that evening they sent cables, quote, not in their own name, but in the name of the Zionist executive in London. The telegrams requested that the recipients immediately dispatch to the Chancellery of the Third Reich declarations to the effect that they do not condone an organized anti-German boycott. The Zionist executive in London learned of this several hours later. They sent another cable to Jerusalem to delay the dispatch of an official declaration to Hitler. Later in his own autobiography, Challenging Years, Stephen Weisse mentioned receiving their cable, but he did not record any cryptic message from the delegation. It is reasonable to assume he would have recorded it if he had thought any such attempt was made. In reality, Weisse repeatedly raged at the ZVFD in the following years for persistently opposing every attempt by foreign Jews to struggle against the Hitler regime. The London proceedings were typical of all further ZVFD behavior. In 1937, after leaving Berlin for America, Rabbi Joachim Prinz wrote of his experiences in Germany and alluded to a memorandum which, it is now known, was sent to the Nazi Party by the ZVFD in June 1933. Prinz's article candidly describes the Zionist mood in the first months of 1933. Quote, Everyone in Germany knew that only the Zionists could responsibly represent the Jews in dealings with the Nazi government. We all felt sure that one day the government would arrange a roundtable conference with the Jews, at which, after the riots and atrocities of the revolution had passed, the new status of German Jewry could be considered. The government announced very solemnly that there was no country in the world which tried to solve the Jewish problem as seriously as did Germany. Solution of the Jewish question? It was our Zionist dream. We never denied the existence of the Jewish question. Dissimulation? It was our own appeal. In a statement notable for its pride and dignity, we called for a conference. Ooh. Yeah. So there you see, like, the consequences of that ideology, that, like, anti-Semitism is, like, permanent and, you know, in a way kind of validating it. And the alignment of interests. So that was revealed, that document was revealed in 1962. Yeah, so the Nazis were asked, further in this memo, very politely, they were asked, quote, "May we therefore be permitted to present our views which, in our opinion, make possible a solution in keeping with the principles of the new German state of national awakening, and which at the same time might signify for Jews a new ordering of the conditions of their existence. Zionism has no illusions about the difficulty of the Jewish condition, which consists, above all, in an abnormal occupational pattern, and in the fault of an intellectual and moral posture not rooted in one's own tradition. An answer to the Jewish question truly satisfying to the national state can be brought about only with the collaboration of the Jewish movement that aims at a social, cultural, and moral renewal of Jewry, a rebirth of national life, such as is occurring in German life, through adhesion to Christian and national values, must also take place in the Jewish national group. For the Jew, too, origin, religion, community of fate, and group consciousness must be of decisive significance in the shaping of his life. On the foundation of the new state, which has established the principle of race, we wish so to fit our community into the total structure so that for us, too, in the sphere assigned to us, fruitful activity for the fatherland is possible. Our acknowledgement of Jewish nationality provides for a clear and sincere relationship to the German people and its national and racial realities. Precisely because we do not wish to falsify these fundamentals, because we, too, are against mixed marriage and are for maintaining the purity of the Jewish group, fidelity to their own kind and their own culture gives Jews the inner strength that prevents insult to the respect for the national sentiments and the imponderables of German nationality. And rootedness in one's own spirituality protects the Jew from becoming the rootless critic of the national foundations of German essence. The national distancing, which the state desires, would thus be brought about easily as the result of an organic development. Thus, a self-conscious Jewry here described, in whose name we speak, can find a place in the structure of the German state because it is inwardly unembarrassed, free from the resentment which assimilated Jews must feel at the determination that they belong to Jewry, to the Jewish race and past. We believe in the possibility of an honest relationship of loyalty between a group-conscious Jewry and the German state. For its practical aims, Zionism hopes to be able to win the collaboration even of a government fundamentally hostile to Jews, because in dealing with the Jewish question, no sentimentalities are involved, but a real problem whose solution interests all peoples, and at the present moment, especially the German people. The realization of Zionism could only be hurt by resentment of Jews abroad against the German development. Boycott propaganda, such as is currently being carried on against Germany in many ways, is in essence un-Zionist, because Zionism wants not to do battle, but to convince and to build. Our observations presented herewith rest on the conviction that in solving the Jewish problem according to its own lights, the German government will have full understanding for a candid and clear Jewish posture that harmonizes with the interests of the state. They say this document, a treason to the Jews of Germany, was written in standard Zionist cliches, abnormal occupational pattern, rootless intellectuals greatly in need of moral regeneration, etc. In it, the German Zionists offered calculated collaboration between Zionism and Nazism, hallowed by the goal of a Jewish state. We shall wage no battle against thee, only against those that would resist thee. Obsessed with their strange mission, the ZVFD's leaders lost all sense of international Jewish perspective and even tried to get the WZO to call off its World Congress, scheduled for August 1933. They sent their world leadership a letter, quote, it will have to express sharp protests. Their lives could be at stake at a time when our legal existence has enabled us to organize thousands and transfer large sums of money to Palestine. The Congress did take place, as we shall see, but the ZVFD had nothing to worry about, as the Nazis chose to use the occasion to announce that they had made a deal with world Zionism. Wow. So
yeah, it is interesting like that. Yeah, today you'll see like Israelis calling like anti-Zionist Jews like capos and things like that. Reading,
right.
You know, when you read that paragraph, you see the actual reality of the situation at the time. It reminds me of how, I'm sure you've heard of this, like after the Holocaust, like a lot of Holocaust survivors who came to Palestine to what was then becoming Israel, they were referred to, like they were kind of looked down upon and thought of as cowards by a lot of settlers there. There was even a slang term where they were called, let me see, what was the word? It's sabonim, which is like Hebrew slang for cowards, but it's like meant to sound like sebon, which means soap, because
soap, people being turned into
exactly
soap.
Like Jewish corpses being made into soap, like
Jesus.
in these death camps.
Was
they
the
would
idea
use
that
as like
they...
a term of abuse for them because
God.
they were seen as like weak, and that they were cowards who
they didn't
just, like,
fight
marched to the
dying or
slaughter.
something.
Exactly, and it's like a humiliation. It's kind of like it's something other people I've definitely seen highlight amidst like the events of the past year, like the idea of like the Freyer,
the sucker,
like
right?
this like the worst thing you can be is like a sucker,
in Israeli culture, this is like a common term of derision. Right?
Yes, exactly, and you constantly positively reinforce for not having that sucker mentality and sort of exploiting the system is like a valorized thing and sort of like cheating in some way, and like getting up on others through kind of underhanded or sly tactics, right? Where if you play by the rules, then you're a mark, Freyer.
You're a
it's
friar.
kind of a similar thing where the sort of conflation of this sort of weak spirit that epitomized in Holocaust survivors, maybe. But it's
right.
Yeah,
and the irony of bashing like diaspora Jews for like organizing boycotts against Nazi Germany and then coming out and saying like they don't understand like the new reality of like race nationalism that has ascended rightfully in Germany, and
I think maybe there's a principle to it. Zionists just hate boycotts. It's not about who it's against. They just hate boycotts in general.
That's true. Very consistently against boycotting. Yeah.
It's just not right. It is.
Right.
That's definitely a darkly humorous historical resonance. Their opposition to the boycott of Nazi Germany.
Which would kind of go on and. That would be a source of conflict in like New York in the 1930s, and also a big issue. I think they get into it probably in this chapter of a lot of the kind of more mainline like Zionist groups just like would not collaborate with any kind of like socialist or Marxist, which there were a lot of like Jewish socialist groups at that time,
right? Mm-hmm.
But they absolutely wouldn't march with them, and so that was they cared more about that than some of these other. Deal making with the Nazis themselves.
There's this great sentence in this book. It's like, prior to the Nazis, German Zionism was no more than an isolated bourgeois political cult. While the leftists were trying to fight the Browners in the streets, the Zionists were busy collecting money for trees in Palestine. We kind of talked a little about the conflict that did exist between these two groups, right? And certainly like how there's... Yeah, exactly, and how there was British patronage of people who were perceived to be anti-communist, particularly within Palestine. So it's interesting that in the German context, like the rise of the Nazis seemed to kind of empower Zionism at the expense of socialism in Jewish communities.
Yeah, like listen, this is a wild. Yeah, like they talk about how racism became triumphant and ZVFD ran with the winner, and the talk of Blut really exploded. And I think at one point they say challenging the racist bona fides of their rivals was not enough. To prove that the Jewish Renaissance movement had always been racist, the Rundschau reprinted 2 pre-1914 articles under the title Voices of the Blood, Das singende Blut by Stefan Zweig and Lied des Bluts by Hugo Salas, rhapsodied about how the modern Jew recognizes his Jewishness through an inner experience which teaches him the special language of his blood in a mystical manner. So
Right.
they're getting into like Himmlerian levels of, yeah, this fever is spreading. They also say, but although these mimics of the Nazis were confirmed racists, they were not chauvinists. They did not think they were racially superior to the Arabs. The Zionists were even going to uplift their benighted Semitic cousins. Their Volkism was only a warped answer to their own, quote, personality problem, as they put it. It allowed them to reconcile themselves to the existence of anti-Semitism in Germany without fighting it. They hastened to reassure their readers that many modern nations and states were racially mixed, and yet the races could live in harmony. Jews were warned, now that they were to become racists, they should not become chauvinists. Quote, above race is humanity.
Wait, that's
I don't
funny.
know.
So
It
they're
is a
saying
kind of a
that
funny
like the
thing.
Zionists who collaborated with the Nazis like were not racist,
Not
but
they were
they've
racist.
gotten worse. They've
but
gotten
yeah,
worse.
They were
Yeah.
not chauvinists. I guess in the sense that they maybe
weren't racist against Arabs at the time, but I don't know if that's quite true. But I can't quite believe that based
I'm
on
not
everything
quite
else that
sure.
we've read, and based on the reality now.
I think
So-
maybe
but
in
certainly
terms
the
of
idea
their-
of uplifting the Arabs, but it's certainly wasn't
Right.
because the Arabs were just as good as they were. It was the opposite. At least
Right.
that's how I would interpret it.
I think this is kind of talking about like the press at the time, like the Jewish press, and how it kind of like positioned itself. And
Right.
how it wasn't, it was sort of going with like the racism part, but they hadn't sort of like set their sights on like the Arabs yet as like their human animals, like blah, blah, blah. But that would come. That would certainly, and also like that on the ground in Palestine, I would say there was some racism present. Yeah, so some of these people, even after the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the German Zionist groups still believed they could reach a modus vivendi with the Nazis. Interesting. So, okay. The Hechalutz Pioneer Center in Germany, in charge of training youth for the kibbutz movement, concluded that the promulgation of laws making mixed marriage a crime was a suitable occasion for a new approach to the regime. The pioneers came up with a plan for the emigration of the entire Jewish community over a period of 15 to 25 years. Abraham Margolio, a scholar at Israel's Yad Vashem Holocaust Institute, has explained the thinking at the center in that fateful year. Quote, the Hechalutz leaders assumed that this underlying goal would prove so alluring to the German authorities that they would agree to extend aid towards further emigration abroad by liberalizing the laws governing the transfer of foreign currency abroad, by providing opportunities for vocational training, and by, quote, political means. Yeah, so this is where then this idea of like, hey, why don't you let everybody move to Palestine kind of starts to pop up. So yeah, the goal of the ZVFD in this era became, quote, national autonomy. They wanted Hitler to give Jews the right to an economic existence, protection from attacks on their honor, and training to prepare them for migration. The ZVFD became absorbed in trying to utilize the segregated Jewish institutions to develop a Jewish national spirit. The tighter the Nazis turned the screw on the Jews, the more convinced they became that a deal with the Nazis was possible. After all, they reasoned, the more the Nazis excluded the Jews from every aspect of German life, the more they would have need of Zionism to help them get rid of the Jews. They mention here that throughout the entire pre-war period, there was only a tiny Zionist involvement in the anti-Nazi underground. Although the Hechalutz and Hashomer youth movements talked socialism, the Nazis were not concerned. Yeshiel Greenberg of Hashomer admitted in 1938 that, quote, our socialism was considered merely a philosophy for export. But almost from the beginning of the dictatorship, the underground KPD, the Communist Party, always looking for new recruits, sent some of their Jewish cadre into the youth movements, and according to Arnold Pauker, now the editor of London's Leo Beck Institute yearbook, some Zionist youth became involved with the resistance, at least to the extent of some illegal postering in the early years of this regime. How much of this was due to the influence of the communist infiltrators, and how much was spontaneous, is impossible to estimate. However, the Zionist bureaucracy vigorously attacked the KPD. As in Italy, so in Germany, the Zionist leadership sought the support of the regime for Zionism and resisted communism. In neither country could it be thought of as part of the anti-fascist resistance. Then they talk about the relationship between the World Zionist Organization and the ZVFD. I guess the WZO agreed on the general line of the German party, but there started to be cracks because some people in like the rank and file did not like this like accommodationist attitude towards the Nazis. Yeah, and the fact that they denounced foreign Jews for boycotting Germany was also like very offensive to some people. So yeah, I guess even the head of the chief European correspondent for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which was a Zionist wire service, Boris Smolar, wrote in 1935, "One can understand that a Jewish newspaper which appears in Germany may not be in a position fully to support the demands of world Jewry with regard to the full restoration of Jewish rights. This, however, doesn't justify any official organ to come out and practically agree to the anti-Jewish limitations which exist in Germany. This last is exactly what the Jüdische Rundschau has done." They say prior to the Nazis, oh yeah, you wrote that, they're little more than an isolated bourgeois political cult. Yeah, collecting, while the leftists were fighting brown shirts in the streets, the Zionists were busy collecting money for trees in Palestine. Yeah, didn't Kamala say once that, like, as a little kid, she, like, collected money to, like, plant trees in Israel?
Yes. Yeah, she
Strange.
did.
Wow, the
and
tree
that
thing.
Was, like, like, she fundamentally empathized with Israelis, like, and related the struggles of people of color to, we read that in, like, one of our episodes before the election about Kamala.
Yeah.
But it's pretty interesting. I'm reading this stuff on page 63. At first, the WZO tried to defend itself against the charges of boycott, scamming, and outright collaboration by insisting that the Havara transfers did not really break the boycott, since Germany did not receive foreign currency for its goods, as they were all purchased inside the country for marks. However, Berlin soon demanded part payment for some of the commodities in foreign currency, and soon, too, the WZO started soliciting new customers for Germany in Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Eventually, the Zionists began exporting oranges to Belgium and Holland using Nazi ships. By 1936, the WZO began to sell Hitler's goods in Britain. The WZO was not interested in fighting the Nazis, and every defense of the Havara scheme demonstrated that. Selig Brodetsky, one of the members of the Zionist executive and later, in 1939, the president of the British Board of Deputies, rebuked the world for scorning them. Congress had risen to a level to which few Jewish bodies could have risen. It was a very easy thing to use violent words, to organize meetings, to call boycotts, but it was a far more difficult thing to speak calmly and to use cool reasoning. It was said that the decisions concerning Germany were too weak. No! Non-Jews could afford to use strong words, but Jews could not. It was not the Zionists who were the traitors. It was everyone else that was out of step, or so at least Moshe Bielenson, a leading labor Zionist, would have had the world believe. This had not been his first effort at collaboration with fascism. In 1922, he had been one of the delegation that pledged Italian Zionism's loyalty to Mussolini. Now he tried to present a theoretical defense of the Nazi pact. After the ghetto walls had been overthrown, our main weapon for the defense of our lives and our rights was the protest. All our protests in the course of decades did not succeed in destroying the reign of persecution, not only in the vast empire of the Tsars, but even in the relatively tiny Romania. The Congress did not, quote-unquote, betray. It triumphed. It was not, quote-unquote, afraid. On the contrary, it had the courage to initiate a new Jewish statesmanship. Verily, the 18th Congress had the courage to destroy the assimilationist tradition, whose chief characteristic is a reliance on others and appeals to others. For generations, we fought by means of protests. Now we have another weapon in our hand, a strong, trusty, and sure weapon, the visa to Palestine. A great majority of Jews opposed the Havara. It had no defenders outside.
We did not say what the Havara was yet.
we didn't explain it?
We didn't explain the Havara agreement yet.
Sorry, I thought that we actually had talked about it.
No. It's kind of at the early part of this chapter.
Yeah,
but
well, we can.
This is like the big. This is a big deal. The Havara agreement.
Yeah.
And this is when there is a formal arrangement for the kind of the movement of capital, German Jewish capital.
Right,
the transfer agreement set up between Zionists and the Nazi government.
Yeah, it's like the most famous like Zionist Nazi pact.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to see where he first talks about it. There's a lot of good shit in the beginning of this chapter.
Yeah, I think it's on 62 that like maybe he brings it up.
Because they talk about Sam Cohen, the businessman, kind of.
Yeah, I think that's probably where he like defines it.
Right, Jabotinsky presented the case for the boycott. Yeah, there's some weird intrigue around this where there's some infighting going on that leads to the Havar Agreement. There's an assassination. So let's see. Yeah, at first, because I think the Havar Agreement was made like after talk of the boycotts was already in motion, right? Because it happened pretty quickly after Hitler took power. I think in New York's Jewish War Veterans, the JWV, announced a trade boycott in March 1933 and organized a huge protest on the 23rd. The mayor of New York took part, and so did the communists, whom the ex-servicemen refused to allow into the demonstration until they took down their banners. Spurning the thousands of communists in New York's Jewish community doomed the tiny veteran group's efforts. Politically extremely naive, the veterans ignored the elementary fact that for a boycott to have even the slightest chance of success, it must have the broadest possible organized unity behind it.
Yeah, it's interesting that Nachman Bialik.
I saw that.
Yeah. Did you read this part? He's like I think related to Mayim Bialik, who's
like a great uncle or something.
Yeah, pretty like prominent like American Zionist figure that you see these days. Mm-hmm. He was thought of then, according to this author, as the poet laureate of Zion. Because of his reputation, his statements were given wide circulation both by the Zionist movement and its left-wing enemies. The poet's concern had long been the breakdown of Jewish unity resulting from the decline of traditional religious faith, and now he could not hide his happiness that Hitler had come just in time to save German Jewry from its own destruction. Hitlerism, the poet feels, has rendered, this is his quote, Hitlerism has rendered at least one service in drawing no lines between the faithful Jew and the apostate Jew. Had Hitler accepted the baptized Jews, there would have developed, Bialik contended, the unedifying spectacle of thousands of Jews running to the baptismal fonts. Hitlerism has perhaps saved German Jewry, which was being assimilated into annihilation. At the same time, it has made the world so conscious of the Jewish problem that they can no longer ignore it. Bialik, like many other Zionists, thought of the Jews as something of a super race. If only they would finally come to their senses and stop wasting themselves on an ungrateful humanity and started working in their own vineyard. Indeed, it is quite true that Judaism, by penetrating into all the nations, actually did undermine the remnants of that sort of idolatry. But perhaps the strongest forces in this process were our, quote, apostate or, quote, assimilated Jews of all types, who entered into the very body of Christianity and stirred its very bowels, and went on slowly undermining the remnants of paganism as a result of their Jewish volition and their Jewish blood. I, too, like Hitler, believe in the power of the blood idea. These were the men, although often the names of great non-Jews are called in their stead, who smoothed the roads for the great movements of freedom all over the world. The Renaissance, liberalism, democracy, socialism, and communism. Anti-Semites sometimes have clear discernment. Jewish influence has indeed been very powerful in this connection. We ought not to deny it. All right.
Okay. Yeah. That's the poet laureate of Zionism.
Yeah, but like you said, by 1934, Zionism was a movement claiming over 1 million members worldwide, and not all of them accepted the upside-down notion that Hitler was a boon to the Jews. Some, like the American rabbi Abraham Jacobson, protested against this insane idea, which was still quite widespread even as late as 1936. He wrote, "How many times have we heard the impious wish uttered in despair over the apathy of American Jews to Zionism, that a Hitler descend upon them? Then they would realize the need for Palestine." I mean, ain't nothing new in that respect.
Right. And it was noted that, there were a number of Zionist organizations, or there are a number of Jewish organizations that did not back the boycott when it was first announced, and a lot of it was for business reasons, including the Democratic Party, who didn't want to were dealing with the Depression and basically just needed German trade and didn't give a fuck. So they didn't help. They say also the American Jewish Committee, the B'nai B'rith, the Sons of the Covenant Fraternal Order, and the Board of Deputies of British Jews refused to back the boycott. They feared if the Jewish workers, and others as well, took it into their heads to fight Hitler, perhaps they would stay in motion and come after their own rich closer to home. No. So yeah, the class trumps everything. So they basically confine themselves to charity efforts and prayed that Hitlerism wouldn't spread. There was the Agudas Yisrael, the Union of Israel, who were like extreme Orthodox, like traditional Orthodox, who you still see this today. Actually, they opposed the boycott on religious grounds, as well as their social conservatism. They claimed ever since the ancient Jewish kingdom was destroyed by the Romans, the Talmud had forbidden Jews to revolt against Gentile authority in the diaspora. They interpreted the boycott as rebellion and therefore forbidden. However, of all the active Jewish opponents of the boycott idea, the most important was the World Zionist Organization. It not only bought German wares, it sold them and even sought out new customers for Hitler and his industrialist backers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The appeal of the blood idea. This quote is insane. This is a very insane. So there was a recent Zionist convert. The popular biographer Emil Ludwig was interviewed by a fellow Zionist on a visit to America and expressed the general attitude of the Zionist movement. Quote, Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but he will have a beautiful monument in Palestine, And here, the biographer historian seemed to assume the role of a patriarchal Jew. Quote, the coming of the Nazis was rather a welcome thing. So many of our German Jews were hovering between two coasts. So many of them were riding the treacherous current between the Scylla of assimilation and the Charybdis of a nodding acquaintance with Jewish things. Thousands who seemed to be completely lost to Judaism were brought back to the fold by Hitler, and for that I am personally very grateful to him. Jesus. Okay, yeah, and then they talk about Bialik being sus and the first dealings with the Nazis.
Yeah, I think this might be some of the background.
Yeah, this gets into some
like Sam Cohen.
This has like Bruce Rappaport vibes, honestly.
Yeah.
So they say that certainly the WCO was quite prepared to try and use the Nazis for their own purposes. The first overtures to the Nazis were made independently in 1933 by one Sam Cohen, the owner of Hanotea Limited, a Tel Aviv citrus export firm. Even under Chancellor Brüning, the German government had put a flight tax on capital leaving the country, and Cohen had proposed that Zionist emigres be allowed to avoid the tax by purchasing goods in Germany, which would later be turned back into cash after sale in Palestine. Brüning had no interest in the idea, but in 1933, Cohen, on his own, presented the plan again. The Nazis were already worried about the effect even the spontaneous and lamentably organized boycott was having on their balance of trade, and Heinrich Wolff, the German consul in Jerusalem, quickly grasped just how useful Cohen's proposition could be. He wrote to his ministry, in this way it might be possible to wage a successful campaign against the Jewish boycott of Germany. It might be possible to make a breach in the wall. The Jews, he argued, would be put in a quandary. Further boycott would be seen as imposing problems on emigrants seeking to find new homes for themselves in Palestine or elsewhere. Because of his location, Wolff was one of the first Germans to perceive the growing importance of Palestine in the Jewish equation, and in June he wrote again to Berlin. Whereas in April and May the Yishuv was waiting boycott instructions from the U.S., it now seems the situation has been transformed. It is Palestine which now gives the instructions. It is important to break the boycott first and foremost in Palestine, and the effect will inevitably be felt on the main front in the U.S. In early May 1933, the Nazis signed an agreement with Cohen for 1 million Reichmarks, $400,000, of Jewish wealth to be shipped to Palestine in the form of farm machinery. At this point, the WCO intervened. The Depression had badly affected donations, and in March 1933 they had desperately cabled to their followers in America, pleading that if funds were not forthcoming immediately, they were heading for imminent financial collapse. Now, Menahem Usichkin, head of the Jewish National Fund, got Cohen to arrange for the release of frozen JNF monies in Germany via Hanotea. The bait for the Nazis was that the cash was needed to buy land for the Jews whom Hitler would be pushing out. Cohen also assured Heinrich Wolff that he would operate, quote, behind the scenes at a forthcoming Jewish conference in London to weaken or defeat any boycott resolution. Dr. Fritz Reichert, the Gestapo's agent in Palestine, later wrote to his headquarters reminding them of the affair, quote, the London boycott conference was torpedoed from Tel Aviv because the head of the transfer in Palestine, in close contact with the consulate in Jerusalem, sent cables to London. Our main function here is to prevent, from Palestine, the unification of world Jewry on a basis hostile to Germany. It is advisable to damage the political and economic strength of Jewry by sowing dissension in its ranks. So, Sam Cohen was soon superseded in these delegate negotiations by labor Zionist Chaim Arlosoroff, the political secretary of the Jewish Agency, the WZO's Palestine Center. Arlosoroff was keenly aware of the movement's problems. In 1932, he had concluded that they had failed to attract enough immigrants to overcome the Arabs' numbers, and they were not drawing enough Jewish capital. Hitler in power would mean war within 10 years. To survive in Palestine and solve the Jewish problem in that period meant swift and vigorous action. Now, he thought, he had the way for Zionism to solve its difficulties. With Britain's agreement, they could get both the immigrants and the capital needed through extending Cohen's project. In an article in the Rundschau and elsewhere, he coldly explained that this could only be done in complete cooperation with Berlin. Quote, "Naturally, Germany cannot expose herself to the risk of upsetting her currency and exchange balance in order to meet the Jews, but a way out can be found to adjust these different interests. It would be worthwhile, leaving all sentimentalities out of the question, to reach such an agreement with Germany." The self-styled socialist Zionists then proposed the ultimate alliance, a deal between the Zionists, the Nazis, the fascists, and the British Empire, to organize the evacuation of Jewry from Germany. Quote, "It could also be possible to establish a company with the participation of the German state and other European, primarily British and Italian interests, which would slowly liquidate the particular properties by issuing letters of credit and creating a guarantee fund." He felt his idea was particularly timely because world opinion would support a, quote, "constructive treatment of the Jewish question in Germany." Knowing the German Jews would not want to put all their money in Hitler's hands, he proposed that the British should choose the fund's manager. His comrade Yitzhak Lufban wrote later that Arlosoroff suggested several names, and the colonial secretary picked one of them. In early May 1933, Arlosoroff and the Nazis came to a preliminary understanding to extend Cohen's arrangements. He visited Berlin again in June, returned to Tel Aviv on June 14th, and 2 nights later, he was assassinated because of his dealings with the Nazis. The killing will be discussed below. It is sufficient to say here that it did not slow down the WZO's accommodation with the Nazis, and a Zionist-Nazi pact was announced by the Nazis in time for the 18th Zionist Congress in August in Prague. Damn. Yeah, I think that's a reference there. There's a lot of intrigue around whether or not Jabotinsky's group assassinated Arlosoroff for making this deal with the Nazis. Mm-hmm. I think the next part kind of gets into, we don't need to go through all of it, but he did oppose it. You know, this is Jabotinsky.
Yeah.
Very
even Jabotinsky was like
hardcore.
Against it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but that was of no avail. And the British had actually arrested several of his revisionists for Arlosoroff's murder, and the prosecutor was putting evidence before the court while the Congress was meeting. As the revisionists had a history of violence against their Zionist rivals, most delegates were convinced of their complicity in the Arlosoroff affair. Their unsavory reputation was enhanced when Jabotinsky's own brown shirts accompanied him into the hall in full military formation, compelling the Presidium to outlaw the uniforms for fear they would provoke Arlosoroff's labor comrades into a dot. Jabotinsky's support for the boycott and his opposition to the pact was dismissed as the raging of a terrorist opponent of the democratically elected moderate leadership. His resolution was defeated by a vote of 240 to 48. Damn.
Yeah, but
yeah.
They do note that defeating his resolution did not necessarily mean that the delegates favored a deal with Hitler when the Nazis announced that they signed an agreement with the Zionists allowing German Jews to ship 3 million Reichmarks worth of Jewish wealth to Palestine in the form of German export goods. You know, that is Havara. Much of the Congress dismissed the statement as a propaganda stunt. When the truth became clear, pandemonium broke loose. The leadership had completely miscalculated and genuinely expected the pact to be immensely popular. Now stunned by the hostile opposition, they tried to protect themselves by outright lying. The labor leader, Burl Locker, brazenly proclaimed, "The executive of the World Zionist Organization had nothing to do with the negotiations which led to an agreement with the German government. No one believed this crude fabrication." Many delegates, particularly the Americans, were in favor of the boycott and voted against Jabotinsky, primarily because they felt the WZO was too preoccupied with Palestine to take on additional chores. Now Stephen Wise presented the leadership with an ultimatum. Explain how to prevent German propagandists from utilizing the agreement. His demand was heatedly discussed all day by the political committee. In the end, the leaders did not dare take official responsibility for the Havara, or transfer agreement, and pretended that it not only bound Germany and the formal signatory, the Anglo-Palestine Bank, pretended that it did only bind Germany with the Anglo-Palestine Bank. But since the bank was their own bank, they only succeeded in making themselves look ridiculous to friend and foe alike. So this is the part that I was talking about before. Yeah, which was
the essence of the agreement.
Yeah.
German Jews could put money into a bank inside Germany, which was then used to buy exports, which were sold outside Germany, usually, but not exclusively, in Palestine. When the emigres finally arrived in Palestine, they would receive payment for the goods that they had previously purchased after they'd finally been sold. Fiscal ingenuity extended Havara's operations in many directions, but throughout its operation, its attraction to German Jews remained the same. It was the least painful way of shipping Jewish wealth out of Germany. However, the Nazis determined the rules, and they naturally got worse with time. By 1938, the average user was losing at least 30% and even 50% of his money. Nevertheless, this was still 3 times, and eventually 5 times, better than the losses endured by Jews whose money went to any other destination. Yeah. So, I guess
they note that there was kind of like a boom in Palestine, among certain people during this time, despite the fact, this is in the midst of the Great Depression, basically.
Right. Yeah, an artificial a period of economic prosperity. Right.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting, what the context for that was, basically the rise of Nazism. And the sort of precursors to the Holocaust.
Yeah, Rabbi Weisse in 1933 referred to the Havara Agreement as the new golden calf, the golden orange, and I guess relating to the citrus industry, and continued, I think I speak for the mind. I think I speak the mind of Jews everywhere when I say we hold in abhorrence any Jew, whether in or out of Palestine, who undertakes to make any commercial arrangements with the Nazi government for any reason whatever. Yeah.
Some 60% of all capital invested in Palestine between August 1933 and September 1939 was channeled through the agreement with the Nazis. Wow,
right. So this is a very direct line of wealth transfer and then population transfer. However, a lot of the immigrants into Palestine in the 1930s, I feel like were from Eastern Europe. They weren't all exclusively German Jews.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
The great majority of Jews opposed the Havara. It had no defenders outside the WZO, and trading with the Nazis was not popular with many inside its own ranks. Protests started pouring in while the Prague Congress was still in session. The pact was extremely unpopular in Poland, where the Jews feared that if there was no resistance to the anti-Semitism next door, their own Jew haters would start demanding that the Polish government imitate the Germans. In America and Britain, each with a more or less democratic tradition, many Zionists, including some of the leading names in the movement, opposed it. The prominent Cleveland rabbi, Abba Hillel Silver, was one of the very first to complain in August 1933. Why the very idea of Palestine Jewry negotiating with Hitler about business instead of demanding justice for the persecuted Jews of Germany is unthinkable. One might think the whole affair was a bankruptcy sale and that the Jews of Palestine were endeavoring to salvage a few bargains for themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, there was some intense opposition in America, particularly in the garment industry trade unions. But most of the Jewish labor leaders in that industry had always looked upon Zionism with contempt, and many of them are from Russia and knew about the fateful Herzl-Plevha meeting and how their old enemy Zubitov had attacked the Poale Zionists against the Bund, blah, blah, blah. As far as they were concerned, the Havara was just Zionism up to its old tricks. And in 1935, Baruch Charny Vladek, the chairman of the Jewish Labor Committee, himself an ex-Bundist from Poland, debated Burl Lonker, the organizational head of the Palestinian Poale Zion, before an overflow crowd in New York. Yeah, in New York, the local labor Zionists were simultaneously supporting the boycott in the U.S. while apologizing for the Havara in Palestine. Wow. Classic.
Yeah, the Weissman quote on 66 is crazy. He says, I know very well the Congress in Lucerne can bypass and take no notice of the German Jewish question, just as did the Prague Congress. I dare to doubt if anyone, especially the German Jews and German Zionists, will gain advantage from the German Jewish question being treated in all thoroughness, moreover in a special report. It will not achieve a positive, useful effect, especially today, in view of the readiness in the world to come to terms with Germany. On the other hand, I believe it is very possible that such a report may become dangerous to the only positive thing we have in Germany, the intensified Zionist movement. We, being a Zionist organization, should concern ourselves with the constructive solution of the German question through the transfer of the Jewish youth from Germany to Palestine, rather than with the question of equal rights of Jews in Germany.
Yeah, pretty clear priorities there.
Yeah, it says, the author writes that constructive was one of Weizmann's favorite cliches. After the First World War, he had assured the capitalists at Versailles that Zionism was constructive, unlike the behavior of those Jews who engaged in destructive tendencies. Constructive thinking with regard to Hitler, so widespread in capitalist circles of the day, was extraordinary coming from a Jew, but of course high Zionism was a world away from the ordinary Jewish mentality. Weizmann's friend, German-born Ruppin, was a good case in point. A race improver, it was he who was in charge of turning middle-class youths into constructive toilers on health-giving Jewish Boden. In 1934, his book, Jews in the Modern World, openly expressed the accommodationist line of the Zionist movement. In it, he told the Jews again that it was their fault that things had occurred in the way that they had, and he admonished them that such an attempt at a peaceful settlement of the problem would have been possible if Jews had recognized that their peculiar position among the Germans was bound to lead to conflicts which had their origin in the nature of man and couldn't be removed by arguments and reason. Had both sides realized that the present position was due not to bad will, but to circumstances which had arisen independently of the will of either side, it would have been unnecessary to attempt a solution of the Jewish problem in an orgy of unbridled hatred.
Wow.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, he continued to say, Weizmann and others continued to say that, not apologize, basically. Enzo Sereni, who's one of the labor Zionists, going around worldwide to, advocate for Zionism, he said at the Luceme Congress that we have nothing to be ashamed of in the fact that we have used the persecution of the Jews in Germany for the upbuilding of Palestine. That is how our sages and leaders of old have taught us, to make use of the catastrophes of the Jewish population in the diaspora for upbuilding. But by far the best example of the leadership's unwillingness to resist the Nazis was Weizmann's statement, quote, "The only dignified and really effective reply to all that is being inflicted upon the Jews of Germany is the edifice erected by our great and beautiful work in the land of Israel. Something is being created that will transform the woe we all suffer into songs and legends for our grandchildren." Jeez, yikes. So resistance, the topic of resistance is really kind of kept off the Congress floor. There was still some resistance to aspects of it, but...
I hadn't heard of this guy, Louis Namier. This is kind of interesting. Yeah, I guess he was like a historian, prefaced Ruppin's book, which, we just mentioned, Jews in the Modern World, the 1934 book. Knowledgeable Zionists, including Nahum Goldman, saw Namier as an intense Jewish anti-Semite. In his devotion to the gentry, he despised the Jews as the epitome of capitalism, a vulgar, quote-unquote, trade. As might be expected, his introduction expressed his, quote, understanding of anti-Semitism. Not everyone who feels uncomfortable with regard to us must be called an anti-Semite, nor is there anything necessarily and inherently wicked in anti-Semitism. In fact, the original draft was even stronger. Weizmann had read it and had to warn Namier not to be so open in expressing their mutual toleration of Nazism. On page 6, the lines, "But what has happened, etc., marked in pencil seem to be dangerous, although I agree with your conclusion. But it's a book by Ruppin and a preface by you, and it will be quoted in Germany, and the louts will say, the Jews themselves think that it will be all for the good, etc. I would admit it if possible." Damn. Wow. I guess the author couldn't find, what actually the original version was and only could find, Weizmann's, or, notes. But I'm curious to know what it was. In the interest of fairness, that does seem like an extreme example, even by Zionist standards, but, pretty galling, pretty worth observing.
Yeah, I'm trying to look. I made a note here from page 78. By 1934, the SS had become the most pro-Zionist element in the Nazi party. Other Nazis were even calling them soft on the Jews. That I think, there's a little more here about Hitler looks at Zionism in chapter 7, which is interesting because that trip by Baron von Mildenstein, the SS officer, ends up being, I think I've seen pictures before of the commemorative coin that has a Star of David on one side and a swastika on the other, commemorating his 6-month stay in Palestine. And, the SS, they're a little bit, they're into the occult, they're into yoga, they're into a little more, these are the satanic priest warrior class.
There were even some Jewish members of the SS, right?
Maybe partially
Yeah,
Jewish.
I just looked up Emil Maurice was Hitler's
okay.
first personal chauffeur and was one of several persons of mixed Jewish and ethnic German ancestry to serve in the SS. Is one example. Although he had according to his Wikipedia article, he had some conflict with Himmler over Jewish heritage. All SS officers had to prove racial purity back to 1750, and it turned out that Maurice had 1/8 Jewish ancestry, I say. But even though he had been a party member since 1919, taken part in the abortive beer hall push, for which he was awarded the prestigious Blood Order, and had been a bodyguard for Hitler, Himmler considered him to be a serious security risk. Himmler recommended that he be expelled from the SS along with other members of his family. To Himmler's annoyance, Hitler stood by his friend. In a secret letter written on 31st August 1935, Hitler compelled Himmler to make an exception for Maurice and his brothers, who were informally declared honorary Aryans and allowed to stay in the SS. So this is a whole phenomenon. There's a couple of honorary Aryans.
Honorary Aryans, yeah, they love
yeah,
doing
including the Grand Mufti himself was granted the status of Aryan, apparently.
Oh, yeah. I noticed
although
here,
I think, that might just be that, Hitler described him as Aryan once and not, some kind of official bestowal of it, but someone might have just put that in the list of honorary Aryans, because of this fixation that we've talked about a lot about the Grand Mufti, so I haven't verified if there's any official conferral of it, but in the way we just described for Emil Maurice.
Right. Yeah, hard to say,
again,
but
I'm just looking at the Wikipedia.
Yeah, interesting. In July 1920, Hitler proclaimed that Palestine was the proper place for the Jews, and that only there could they hope to get their rights. Articles supporting emigration to Palestine began appearing in the Nazi Party organ, the Volkischer Beobachter, after 1920, and periodically their propagandists would return to the point. But then, later on, he kind of goes on to be well, they're too evil and depraved to actually build their own state because they're so, they're parasites, whatever. Okay, we're getting this Nazi patronage of Zionism. In June 1932, the centerpiece for one of the largest anti-Jewish rallies in Silesian Breslau was a huge banner telling the Jews to, quote, get ready for Palestine. Right. So one-way ticket to Palestine, a lot of jokes and memes like that, right?
Right.
Yeah, and stuff like that. Emigration was the obvious solution. But where to? Not only would wholesale Jewish immigration make Berlin unpopular among other capitals, but what would happen after the arrival? This is what the Nazis were thinking about. They might incite other people, other countries against the Reich and, affect their trade. So it was within this context that the Aeonists, Sam Cohen of Hanotea and the ZVFD in Germany first appeared with their proposals. Havara had several obvious advantages to the Nazis. If Jews went to Palestine, they would only be able to complain to other Jews. In fact, they would even be a moderating influence there, since the fear of worse consequences for their relatives in Germany, if anything were done to make the Nazis cancel the transfer, would make them reluctant to agitate on a large scale. But the most important use of the Havara Agreement was for propaganda. The Nazis now had something to show their foreign detractors who said they were incapable of any policy towards the Jews other than physical brutality. In October 1933, Hitler crowed that it was he, not his critics, who really was the Jews' benefactor. Quote, in England, people assert that their arms are open to welcome all the oppressed, especially the Jews who have left Germany. But it would be still finer if England did not make her great gesture dependent on the possession of 1,000 pounds. England should say, anyone may enter, as we unfortunately had done for 30 years. Oh, open borders. If we too had declared that no one could enter Germany save under the condition of bringing with him 1,000 pounds or paying more, then today we should have no Jewish question at all. So we wild folk have once more proved ourselves better humans, less perhaps in external protestations, but at least in our actions. And now we are still as generous and give to the Jewish people a far higher percentage as their share in possibility for living than we ourselves possess. Okay, yeah. So, in Nazi Germany regarded the will of the Führer as having the force of law. And once Hitler had pronounced, an avowedly pro-Zionist policy developed. Also in October, Hans Frank, then the Bavarian Minister of Justice, later Governor General of Poland, told the Nuremberg Parteitag that the best solution to the Jewish question for Jews and Gentiles alike was the Palestinian national home. Still in October, the Hamburg South American Shipping Company started a direct service to Haifa, providing, quote, strictly kosher food on its ships under the supervision of the Hamburg Rabbinate. Jews could still leave for any country that would have them, but now Palestine became the propagandist's preferred solution to the Jewish question. Yeah, our official goodwill go with them. Here it is. By 1934, the SS had become the most pro-Zionist element in the Nazi party. Other Nazis were even calling them soft on the Jews. Baron von Mildenstein had returned from his 6-month visit to Palestine as an ardent Zionist sympathizer. Now, as the head of the Jewish department of the SS's security service, he started studying Hebrew and collecting Hebrew records. When his former companion and guide, Kurt Tuchler, visited his office in 1934, he was greeted by the strains of familiar Jewish folk tunes. There were maps on the walls showing the rapidly increasing strength of Zionism inside Germany. Von Mildenstein was as good as his word. He not only wrote favorably about what he saw in the Zionist colonies in Palestine, he also persuaded Goebbels to run the report as a massive 12-part series in his own Der Angriff, The Assault, the leading Nazi propaganda organ. This is in 1934. His stay among the Zionists had shown the SS man, quote, the way to curing a centuries-long wound on the body of the world, the Jewish question. It was really amazing how some good Jewish Boden under his feet could enliven the Jew. Quote, the soil has reformed him and his kind in a decade. This new Jew will be a new people. To commemorate the Baron's expedition, Goebbels had a medal struck, on one side the swastika, on other the Zionist star. In May 1935, Reinhard Heydrich, who was then the chief of the SS Security Service, later the infamous protector of the Czech lands incorporated into the Reich, wrote an article, The Visible Enemy, for Das Schwarze Korps, the official organ of the SS. In it, Heydrich assessed the various tendencies among the Jews, comparing the assimilationists quite invidiously with the Zionists. His partiality toward Zionism could not have been expressed in more unmistakable terms. Quote, after the Nazi seizure of power, our racial laws did in fact curtail considerably the immediate influence of Jews. But the question as he sees it is still, how can we win back our old position? We must separate Jewry into two categories, the Zionists and those who favor being assimilated. The Zionists adhere to a strict racial position, and by emigrating to Palestine, they are helping to build their own Jewish state. Heydrich wished them a fond farewell. Quote, the time cannot be far distant when Palestine will again be able to accept its sons, who have been lost to it for over 1,000 years. Our good wishes, together with our official goodwill, go with them. That's a sus endorsement. But yeah, that was Reinhard Heydrich endorsing moving to Palestine, right?
Yeah.
So you can see here, there's actually quite a lot of even official Nazi this rocks. So let's do this,
Yeah.
These are it almost borderline. I mean, they're too anti-Semitic to say these are the good Jews, but they're kind of operating in that similar kind of dichotomy, right?
Yeah, it seems like there was definitely a ton of Nazi support for it. I guess they, as this book says, they were the prime gainers from it. So
right, and it would make sense, even though they, of course, ended up with the death camps and mass extermination and all these things. I think this book discusses it a little earlier in the chapter of how early did Hitler think about exterminating all the Jews back in the 1920s, or is this something that sort of came about later once the war had started? The final solution, right? And it's a little bit murky, but you could see that for expediency's sake, this idea would potentially appeal to the Nazis in the 1930s.
Yeah.
It's a relatively sort of low cost way, and they are kind of concerned a little bit with their public image abroad and not attracting too much heat for their anti-Semitic policies, right? Their persecutions.
Yeah. Did you read this quote from Benes, Goldman's quote from Benes?
I didn't, but you could read that if you want. The leader of Czechoslovakia warning them, right?
Yeah, it's pretty good. The Czech foreign minister, Edvard Benes. Goldman's vivid account of Benes' warning to the Jews says all that will ever need to be said on the Havara and the abject failure of the WZO to resist the Nazis. Don't you understand, he shouted, that by reacting with nothing but half-hearted gestures, by failing to arouse world public opinion and take vigorous action against the Germans, the Jews are endangering their future and their human rights all over the world. And Nahum Goldman, who I guess later on sort of reflected with guilt on his role in all this, he says, I knew Benes was right. In this context, success was irrelevant. What matters in a situation of this sort is a people's moral stance, its readiness to fight back instead of helplessly allowing itself to be massacred. Interesting.
Yeah, and people were telling them this is like not good. People were warning.
Yeah, it's interesting how like now that same sentiment of like allowing yourself to be massacred is pressured on, you know, those who weren't Zionists when it was, you know, the WZO that was largely complicit in this. So
yeah, this next section, the Nazis asked for a quote more Zionist behavior. Yeah, I mean, the Zionist movement was restricted severely in Germany in the 1930s. Like, the Rundschau was banned on at least 3 occasions. So, like, they were still dealing... It's not like they were totally exempt from being persecuted or fucked with, but nevertheless,
Definitely
they persisted
not,
in... Because they had this one goal in mind of getting everybody to Palestine.
I mean, it's a really common pathology that's not exclusive to Zionists or to Jews or to anybody, which is like this just like sucking up and internalizing the ideas of the people who hate you and a notion of like your own kind of, I mean, you see it today, right? Like how many people do we see like whatever of any kind of minority group who kind of like carve out a niche for themselves as being compatible or being like one of the good ones.
Yeah.
Right. Or, you know, kind of the insert minority group here, whisperer, who can, you know, explain how like, yeah, like your instincts are mostly right about us, but like, you know, this is why like it's okay. And, you know, you should give us this like little pittance, even though ultimately that won't be. I mean, I can think of a million Muslims like that, or a million times like similar sentiments have been expressed by Muslims trying to like cozy up to like right-wing Christians in the United States or something like that, you know? But
you see it with like the Kurds.
Other example. Yeah, like there's basically a million different examples. South Asian Hindus, you can see it with them as well.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, in U.S. and European politics.
To some extent, some of the like Ukrainians, maybe Ukrainian nationalists, willing to do just about anything for that NATO cosign.
Yeah, I mean, black people in the United States. You can see examples of it. Like the based black person is definitely a phenomenon.
Right. So this next chapter actually really focuses on Palestine itself. It mentions the huge influx between 1933 and 1936. 164,267 Jewish immigrants poured into Palestine. 61,854 came in 1935 alone. The Jewish minority increased from 18% of the population in 1931 to 29.9% in December 1935, and the Zionists saw themselves becoming the majority in the not-too-distant future, which, you know, they say the Arabs noticed this, and, you know, that's when, obviously, you know, a year later, there would be an Arab revolt, right?
Yeah.
Let's see, yeah. It talks about Palestinian Arab politics being dominated by a handful of rich clans, as we've mentioned before, right? The Al-Husseinis and Khalidis and Nashashibis, right? They're rivals. It talks about, you know, Al-Husseini getting patronage from Mussolini, which was secret until 1935. The Haganah's goal, a Jewish majority in Palestine.
There's a funny part on 110 where it talks about how Jabotinsky and those people's defense of Mussolini and how like they refuse to acknowledge that like the great Mufti, you know, Amin al-Husseini collaborated with the Italian fascists, but like not because they were trying to defend the Mufti or anything.
Because Mussolini's based.
Exactly. Like Mussolini wouldn't do that. Like, you know, like he wouldn't work with the Arabs, you know.
Oh my God. Crazy. Yeah, they talk about the Peel Commission. We might get to this stuff like next time about mentions Al-Qassam for the first time. And
I mean that's a whole topic that we should talk about,
Yeah.
like, Marx, such an important figure, whose legacy obviously plays a huge role in current events, even outside of the context of this book. It'd be good to talk about him.
Right. Mentions the Haganah was authorized by the British to negotiate directly with the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the security service, the SS. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, Feivel Polks, the Haganah agent, arrived in Berlin in 1937 and was assigned Adolf Eichmann as his negotiating partner. Eichmann actually was a protege of the pro-Zionist von Mildenstein, and like his mentor, had studied Hebrew, read Herzl, and was the SD's specialist on Zionism. That is actually interesting that then, like, he's the top Nazi that they... I mean, he was involved in the Holocaust, but, like, he was kind of the one guy, like, the Mossad, like, captured and put on trial years later. But actually, before the Holocaust, he was part of this, like, kind of SS wing that was, like, pro-Zionist, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Haganah offered to spy for the Nazis, which is crazy.
Well, since we're here, I mean, do you want to jump to that article you found to close out?
Oh yeah, that might be a good
there's
thing
a little,
to do.
There's
I
a
feel
little
like
more
there's
stuff
more
in here,
this
but
book that like we might want to talk about, because there is some definitely good material. Like just talking about like the Haganah kind of collaborations with the SS and all these things. But maybe we can come back after.
I think we come back to
we're
it
in the
next
Arab
time.
Revolt. The 1936 revolt. It's kind of confusing when you're doing this long narrative, but yeah, I thought this would be a good counterpiece to this. It's a bit of an old article, but it's pretty good, and I think it's worth like reading or talking about, because I don't know, I thought of it as a counter piece to this because, or an accompaniment to this, because it sort of deals with another aspect of the discourse, how the Holocaust is kind of instrumentalized, or generally the World War II period. The Holocaust really is instrumentalized in the current discourse around Israel and Palestine. It's an article it's published in Die Welt des Islams, called Arabs and Fascism, Empirical and Theoretical Perspectives. It's published in 2012 in an issue, I guess, themed on Islamofascism. But this article is kind of a critique of the idea of Islamofascism. I'll just read the beginning. I won't read the whole article. I'll skip to the most relevant part, but just to situate it, I'll read the first little part, because it kind of reiterates some of what we've been saying throughout this series about the discourse of this. This article combines an inventory of empirical research about pro-fascist trends in the regions, primarily until 1945, with an attempt to locate fascism in the Arab world in a broader context of international or generic fascism as a phenomenon of non-European societies. This latter part of the paper is comparative and theory-driven, but has to remain eclectic due to the limits of the short article format. The topic has an awkward currency today, after a surge in anti-Islamic rhetoric in the public discourse in post-9/11 period. Within this debate, the term Islamofascism plays a central role, with Nazi Germany and especially the imprint that Nazi anti-Semitism left on Arabs, Arab nationalist ideology, and political Islam. The debate often focuses on Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, and his exile in Germany from 1941 to 1945, and his deep involvement in anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda to the Middle East. For propagators of the Islamo-fascism paradigm, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and his alleged admiration for the Mufti serve I got distracted by something. Serve as the missing link between Amin al-Husseini and the Muslim Brotherhood, and an extension, modern Islamism. In turn, this argumentation establishes a relationship between the Mufti, Nazi totalitarianism, anti-Semitism, and modern-day Islamism, as well as Arab nationalism. I'll stop there because, we know all of this, but you can kind of just see how... but anyway, I don't, necessarily agree with everything in this article, but certainly not every perspective that's mentioned. But it is definitely interesting to read about how kind of dealing with this idea and what actually the influence of fascist ideas were in Palestine in the lead up to the establishment of the State of Israel and the Nakba, and how ideas sort of transformed over that period. Because obviously, there's a lot of misconceptions, but it, is definitely true that there is like an appetite in the Arab world for anti-Semitism that we've discussed, and also sort of sympathy for Nazi ideas does exist, right? But, to what extent is it overblown? How is it instrumentalized? It's an interesting conversation. So yeah, he goes through a bunch of different paradigms in the discourse around Arab fascism. And one important thing that he notes is that, it was definitely not uniform or homogenous in any way, the reception of fascism in the Arab world, obviously. But overall, in terms of the Holocaust and in terms of Nazism, there was a big shift after 1948. He talks about these two authors, Goetz Nordbruck and René Wild Angel. Interesting last name. I don't know. It seems like he's French, but anyway, have recorded the dissonance of voices that emerged from Syria and Palestine. And I have presented that even staunch Arab nationalists in Iraq were highly eclectic in their perception and adaptation of European thought. Their admiration for a totalitarian state organization coincided with a deep skepticism about anything that came from the West. Israel Gershoni and James Jankowski's work highlights the critical Egyptian discourse about fascism and Nazism in intellectual journals that were authoritative as shapers of intellectual standpoints throughout the Arab-speaking world. They also present how intellectuals like the Egyptian Salama Musa transited from supporters of Nazism in the early 1930s, transisted from supporters of Nazism in the early 1930s to fierce opponents under the impression of the Abyssinian War. And they highlight the remarkably outspoken stance of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, against Nazism. At the same time, they also highlight many instances of support of Nazism in the 1930s, such as the movement and party Young Egypt. It remains astonishing, however, how Arabs, including intellectuals and political leaders, moved almost seamlessly from the critical stance of the pre-war years to one of sympathy for Nazi racist politics that had been a mainstay of Arab public discourse since the end of World War II. How was it possible that the language of Nazi anti-Semitism was so quickly adopted after World War II? Arabs were avid consumers of news media in the 1930s, and they were well aware of what was going on in Europe during the 1930s and the World War, as analysis of the Arab press has shown in recent years. Anti-Semitic topoi and imagery were also known in the Arab world, and some had adopted them in the propagandistic confrontations of the violent second half of the 1930s during the Palestine Revolt. The propaganda speeches of Amin al-Husseini received some attention, even if they probably sounded quite alien in their fierceness to many listeners in the Arab world during a time when the Palestine conflict lay dormant because of the war. The paradigmatic change of the war of 1948, however, opened the doors to a repertory of images that could be used to denigrate and vilify the opponent, but arguably in a psychological sense to overcome the collective trauma of defeat and humiliation at the hands of the Zionists. Then he has kind of this interesting passage where he talks about like a phenomenology of fascism. It goes into some kind of a theory by this German historian Ernst Nolte. I think, in the interest of time, you guys can look up the article, Arabs and Fascism by Wien. And of course, I'll put it in the show notes, but I'll kind of skim over that and move just a little bit further down. So he says, I'm not endorsing Nolte's paradigm when I argue that interwar pro-fascist trends, and in particular those of the 1930s, were just one variety of a theme of political radicalism and the fascination it exerted on those who were in their late teens and 20s during the period. In a recent book, Ilham Khari Makdisi threw light on a shared pre-World War I culture of radicalism, a term which she uses to denote the left-wing radicalism as opposed to, for instance, nationalism, in the Mediterranean with a free flow of ideas and political practices that travel with the streams of migrants. Anarchism, I guess I compressed these two words, anarchism and futurism, and left as well as right-wing radicalism were not clearly discernible ideas at the time, and especially not in the chaotic first years after 1918. Even later, during the interwar period, radicalism still held a lot of temptations as a trait of the global market of ideas, especially in the colonial world where young, educated men became increasingly politicized, but were most of the time barred from affecting their political positions in functions. In my own work on Iraq, I contextualize the occurrences of pro-totalitarian and pro-fascist thought in the Iraqi public discourse during the interwar period. I describe this discourse in the Iraqi nationalist press as a field that moved rather freely between pro-totalitarian, pro-fascist, and pro-Nazi references without a clear commitment to any of these positions. Intellectuals and publicists borrowed freely in a highly eclectic manner and did not worry too much about consistency. They reworked what they adopted and adapted it to a particular local debate overshadowed by the demands of decolonization. For example, I presented the young hothead Yunus Sabawi as a multiplier of radical ideas that he absorbed with a great detail of eclecticism and distributed among his friends and associates. Sabawi himself expressed the confusion that members of his generation suffered when they had to juggle ideas of early 20th century theorists like Le Bon and Bergson, who also provided fodder for the European right-wing extremists of the 1920s and 1930s. Sabawi and his associates imbibed these ideas, but they also had little reservation when dealing with communists. Moreover, I used the term fascist imagery to explain the uses of fascist symbols in the political public, the fascist salute, the wearing of uniforms, etc., and the establishment of youth organizations that so much resembled the European fascist youth. I refrain from calling these organizations fascist because there are many characteristics that they do not share with either their Italian or German counterparts. Iraq's Futua youth organization was not attached to any party, but was established as a state organization during Yassin al-Hashimi's term as prime minister from 1935 to 1936. It was endorsed by a broad coalition of the political establishment, including British diplomats who regarded it as an offshoot of the Boy Scout movement rather than a fascist organization that could threaten the hegemony of a pro-monarchical elite over the state. Originally, the Futua was ethnically and religiously inclusive. Iraqi Jews participated enthusiastically in al-Futua's sporting and hiking activities and singing of national hymns. In other Arab countries, some of these groups we've actually mentioned before in different contexts, youth organizations were mostly strike forces of political parties, and thus not an unambiguous representation of a fascist trend. In some cases, they represented partisan interests, such as the Christian white badges in Aleppo, instead of a nationalist agenda. The uniforms of the Damascene and Aleppian iron shirts concealed that these were groups of urban roughs that rather represented the clientele politics of the bourgeois National Bloc Party and its control over traditional networks in the city than the spirit and desires of young nationalist extremists. Some examples stand out, however, such as the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, the SSNP, that Antun Saadeh founded in the 1930s. The mere adoption of the name and the party's symbol, al-Zabaa, which is reminiscent of a swastika, are probably the closest mimicry of Nazi symbols of all Middle Eastern parties we know, but Saad's explicit rejection of ethnic racism, though not of racial thinking, and his vision of the Syrian nation is a crucial example for the adaptation of European ideology to a specific local context. But even then, German historian and political scientist Christoph Schulman has pointed out that ideology only played a minor role in the young followers' adherence to their leader. They cared less about the contents of books and treatises, but enjoyed the feeling of communal activism and the display of strength. This was more, quote, showing off than pressing a point. Differentiation and contextualization are therefore once more of paramount importance. I think this is just an interesting analysis of the dynamics of like even like defining fascism, something that's like relevant for people in the United States, definitely. Like, and sort of since we've been talking about like how this connects to sort of other discourses circulating now in the American popular discourse. Like it is interesting. Like how do you call something fascist that isn't like how do you define fascism in order to apply this to something other than the Italians and the Germans during that particular period of time, right? Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. It seems almost like, there's almost no clear-cut case other than people who like are very clearly hearkening, even when people very clearly hearken to that tradition
imagery.
Still. Yeah, exactly.
Like the gesture of love by Elon Musk,
Yeah, exactly. The gesture of love. But I've even heard like, leftists and stuff like sort of criticize the idea that like imagery and rhetoric matters at all.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, thinking of Daniel Bessner in particular. I remember listening to an interview that he did with that guy, David Austin Walsh, who, I don't admire in any way. I'm not saying that he didn't have partially a point in this exchange, but I remember him being very adamant that, like, it was just so misleading to use fascist to describe the American right wing, because fascism is about more than rhetoric, And this is like saying that, yeah, sure, there may be Aryan Christians out there today, but it's not a meaningful, like, term of political analysis today. Which I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that these groups are some of them obviously aren't. I agree with Wayne's statements, but obviously, I wouldn't go that far either, as to say basically that it's irrelevant.
That like only Italian and German things between
or that like imagery and rhetoric don't matter in terms of making some defining what fascism is, or that like fascism isn't partially like an effective phenomenon or a rhetorical phenomenon or something emotional.
No, I think that's
an emotive character. Yeah,
I certainly strongly agree with that. But
yeah,
there's all kinds of like affective qualities of like of fascism that are not. If you're a little bit like too strictly just looking at like the material conditions of like their policies or something like that, you can kind of miss like it's kind of this like mystical in-group thinking, like kind of messianic, there is that. And there's even like not all fascist regimes throughout the 20th century maybe like went as hard in that. I'm thinking about like South American like military dictatorship kind of that I would describe probably as using fascist techniques of governance, and we're definitely kind of aligned with international fascist elements, but maybe weren't, building kind of like a mystical, like Blut und Boden kind of like thing necessarily. It was a little more like transactional. These are also like Cold War puppet states. So, your mileage varies. But at the same time, I mean, I think we could definitely see like some of these Silicon Valley motherfuckers like definitely trafficking in fascist imagery. I mean, from 4chan to X. A lot of fascist imagery being trafficked around. And I think that stuff does matter. Like, it's despite whatever the person doing it says their politics are, like it has some kind of effect,
Or, sort of splitting hairs over the economic or like the sort of state structures that constitute fascism or whatever, like that type of thing. I think that's never really been what fascism as a phenomenon that we can talk about was primarily about. I think it's kind of about like a position vis-a-vis like the past and vis-a-vis like a vision of the a return to the past like against like the present through like strength and through like crushing people who are seen as like weak or like a drain on the body politic in some way.
Outsiders,
I think, like,
invaders, parasites.
Yeah,
like that type
I feel like
of
that
other,
is like
them,
more constitutive than like I don't know, like corporatist organization or something like. But anyway, whatever.
Right, or I think as it was said, like as Brenner said, kind of succinctly, like the core of fascism was like kind of like psyoping the middle class to like attack workers and like destroy Marxists, like destroy any kind of like workers movement over that threaten capital, like in a way. And I think that still generally applies to like most things. I think the term fascist also does get it gets abused by libs sometimes who throw it around like very freely, but at the same time,
yes, definitely. Yeah, I think that people can also go too far in the direction where like they get negatively polarized because of like, you know, libs cringily screeching about fascism, that they have like for that that is not a good reason to avoid thinking about like contemporary politics or in terms of fascism, or like, you know, a good reason to be afraid to use that term or to even think, you know, that this is something to be wary of. I think that's actually, but anyway, this is actually a very interesting thing about like the perception of fascism, like in the Arab context, that I think is very relevant to how like it gets talked about in the sort of discourse of Israel and Palestine, that, you know, I want to bring it back to. This is a good part. Okay. Looking at individual youth movements and the context they emerge from, at the usage of fascist imagery and the manifestations of a pro-totalitarian discourse in the media of the time, is an approach that highlights them as distinctive, singular phenomena that had to be understood within the more or less narrow context of local grievances and various political or social agendas. In the case of Middle Eastern countries of the interwar period, the demands of decolonization loom large, but also the necessity for elite politicians to adopt what they perceived as a modern outlook that concealed their paternalistic vision of a disciplined society. A fascist self-fashioning of parties or their leaders thus provided a bridge between different generations of political activists in order to prevent the upheaval of a younger generation against the bourgeois nationalists of Syria and Iraq. The older generation had grown into an elite, unwilling to let go of power and privilege, but at the same time tainted by cooperation with the colonial power, such as, for instance, in the case of the Syrian National Bloc. This bridging of the generations happened at the expense of the younger and no doubt contributed to their radicalization and their openness for totalitarian ideas. According to a phenomenology of fascism in the Middle East, the adoption of fascist principles was superficial because it happened precisely out of a defensive position and of a concern for, quote, being modern in a way that would challenge the comparatively liberal nationalist leanings of an older generation. And this part is good too. This is probably the best section, a typology of generic fascism. How do these statements hold up in light of approach C, that is the typology of generic fascism, looking for commonalities in the ways how fascist imagery and discourse were used in non-European and especially decolonizing societies? It is fruitful to establish a type of global fascism as a part of a global typology.
Is it fruitful?
Yeah, is it? Oh, sorry. Yeah, is it fruitful to establish a type of global fascism as a part of a global typology of generic fascism? ? Or would the claim that such a type exists simply be a representation of Eurocentrism, and that it would reflect a general disregard for the specificities of non-European societies? In other words, is there a generic non-European fascism, or maybe even colonial fascism? The term global fascism is, strictly speaking, an aporia. Fascism, like all nationalisms, is exclusivist in its nationalism and rests on an ever clearer, if not radical or even brutally violent definition of the other. Yeah, exactly. Fascism is therefore necessarily compartmentalized. At most, it exists as various fascisms. What we can speak of, though, is fascism as a global phenomenon, and we can look for a taxonomy or typology of fascism, and for international contexts and transnational channels of ideological exchange. However, the existence of a clearly shaped and colorful imagery of Italian fascism and German German Nazism, the often referred to aesthetics of fascism, exacerbates the shaping of such a taxonomy. Italy and Germany set the parameters of the fascist imaginary for an early medialized global culture. They defined the fascist brand in popular culture as an effective vehicle for spreading the message. In advertising, however, the brand says little about the content. With regard to content, there is no shortage of theories of fascism, and it is impossible to do all of them justice in the confines of this article. Moreover, they are often ambiguous and hardly withstand critical case-by-case testing, extending from a Marxist critique of fascism as capitalism in crisis to theories that are so vaguely formulated that every occurrence requires the opening of a new category. Many theories point to anti-communism and anti-liberalism, mass following and mass party organization, the cult of violence and the Führer principle, as well as radical nationalism as common traits of fascism, often combined with racism and a specific fascist style of politics. For some, the problem to pinpoint fascism is that there is no single foundational text for all of its colors. There is no fascist manifesto. It would be remiss, though, to draw the conclusion that fascism as a phenomenon was void of ideology. The British historian and political theorist Roger Griffin sees fascism largely as a product of late 19th century anti-Enlightenment trends. For Griffin, fascism evolved out of a mythical understanding of the world at a breaking point, offering palingenesis, or a rebirth of the individual into a meaningful national community, leaving behind the fragmented and allegedly overly scientistic world of the early 20th century that imploded during World War I. For Griffin, as for many other theorists of fascism, the World War I frontline experience was instrumental in bringing about fascist movements of like-minded seekers of new meaning that were channeled by the communitarianism and, quote, festival culture of the fascist movements. Roger Eatwell, I wonder how someone ends up with that last name, sorry, but Roger Eatwell adds that fascist ideology claimed to offer a, quote, radical third way based on the creation of an integrative and exclusive, as well as totalitarian, national community. In Eatwell's model, the fascist style of the shirt movements, the obsession with action over theory, the cult of violence, the demonization of the other are only accidental matters of appearance. So are negatives of other definitions of fascism, anti-communism, anti-liberalism. They were part of fascism propaganda, but not its substance. This definition would provide as added value a platform for an assessment of post-1945 movements in the Arab world, such as Baathism and Nasserism, and the regimes that drew on them, because it avoids the rather simplistic focus on the slogans and uniforms of fascist self-fashioning. Such an inquiry is, however, beyond the scope of this article. Similar to Roger Griffin, Zeev Sternhell insists that fascism was not just a function of the disruption that World War I caused. Fascism has a core of ideas and cannot be reduced to a reaction to the destruction of 19th century society and to the emergence of Leninist and Stalinist systems, as Nolte's phenomenology would suggest. Nolte kind of said Stalinism and fascism were the same thing, like same different expressions of the same fundamental phenomenon.
Yeah, I think he also said that the Holocaust was just a reaction to the Holodomor. He was the first guy to really ride hard at that theory. It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Sternhell instead points to the revolutionary roots of fascist thought and its hatred of the Enlightenment as well. Was there comparable anti-Enlightenment reasoning in the Middle East? During the interwar period, admirers of fascism such as Salam Moussa or the young enthusiasts of Iraq and Syria saw themselves in the tradition of the modernizing forces of the Enlightenment to free or make better use of the potentials of the individual. This is a very interesting thing, I think, about intellectual culture in the Arab world in the 20th century. It's anyway, I don't want to digress but the authoritarianism of the interwar and immediate post-World War II Arab states was rather based on paternalistic authoritarian traditions of the late Ottoman polity than on the adoption of totalitarian ideas. It has nevertheless been argued that the second half of the 1930s in Egypt in particular, but also in the Middle East in general, represents a period of crisis of orientation among intellectuals and a frustration with the perceived failure of the so-called quote-unquote liberal experiment. Once more, this argument invokes Ernst Nolte's reasoning about the foundations of radical political movements in the interwar period. Nolte suggested that the liberal system, not as a political actuality, but as a dominant worldview of the bourgeoisie, offered the radical freedom to realize its opposite and to give in to a totalitarian temptation. I have argued myself that the socio-political situations of general conflict before World War II was conducive to a mindset among young intellectuals that made them play with all sorts of radical temptations. But it is almost banal to argue that colonial dependence did not offer Arab politicians and intellectuals enough opportunity to actually, quote-unquote, give in to these temptations in a significant way. The only example of a totalitarian experiment in the Arab Middle East during the first half of the 20th century was arguably the so-called Rashid Ali movement in Iraq in 1941, which, as I have shown elsewhere, was ambiguous in its orientation, geographically limited, and did not last long enough to allow for broad conclusions about the feasibility of totalitarian radicalism in an Arab state. The multipolar relationship between local elites in the Arab lands and their contenders of a younger generation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the British and the French imperialist hegemons in their states, and the Nazi and fascist challengers of the post-World War I world order, as many Arabs perceive them, created a highly complex cocktail of political opinions and opportunities that is unlike the socio-political situation of sovereign states that paved the way for the ascendance of fascist movements in Europe after 1918. The aforementioned research by Gershoni and Jankowski has put this crisis of orientation into perspective, arguing that authoritarian and pro-fascist voices were just a few in a plurality of opinions in the Egyptian and broader Arab intellectual field. This cacophony of voices forbids arguing for a general, radical rejection of humanism and reason among Middle Eastern intellectuals and politicians at the time. Moreover, the peculiar geostrategic situation of World War II does not allow to draw hard conclusions from the deliberations of Arab politicians and, in few cases, the decisions about the alliances as they happened in Iraq in 1941, in Tunisia during the German occupation between 1942 and 1943, when monarch Monjef Bey tried to keep equidistance from both the Allies and the Axis powers, or in Egypt during the February 4th incident of 1942, when the British, with Rommel advancing, forced King Farouk at gunpoint to give up his idea of appointing his pro-Axis confidant Ali Mahir as prime minister. It is not an apologetic argument that there is little basis for a comparison between radical political and intellectual movements in the Arab world and fascism in Europe. As a matter of fact, right-wing political radicalism did exist in the Arab lands, and it bore resemblances to fascist movements in Europe and worldwide during the interwar period. This radicalism may not have had an immediate impact on interwar and wartime Arab politics, but it is arguable that it prepared the ground for long-term authoritarian trends in the post-war Arab states. In a recent analysis, Federico Finkelstein introduces a way to apply a global fascist taxonomy usefully in the context of Argentina between the two world wars. Finkelstein argues that only an open, and in my terminology, phenomenological approach justifies the usage of the term fascism in a non-European context at all. The tendency of many historians of fascism in Europe to establish a rigid taxonomy and on its basis to rule out that fascism ever existed outside Europe represents for Finkelstein an example of Eurocentric exclusivity. Finkelstein argues, in contrast, that the Argentine adoption of fascism needs to be understood as a chaotic and unsystematic process, yet one that was pursued by its actors in a very self-conscious manner, in a process of making sense of models perceived from a distance, but in a local context. It is Finkelstein's project to explain how this quote-unquote making sense actually worked, and how it represents just one manifestation of a process that affected many societies worldwide. In a similar way, historians of South Asia are grappling with the question of how to contextualize the manifestations of fascist-inspired thinking among intellectuals like Inatullah Khan al-Mashriki in the fascist aesthetics of his Khaksar youth movement in the 1930s. Or, of Modi. But anyway, I guess this is maybe a little bit before that stuff came into the consciousness. Yeah. In this regard, well, there is no such thing as, and this is also talking about the early 20th century, but in this regard, there was no such thing as global fascism. It nevertheless became a traveling transnational ideology and a reference point. An open, flexible taxonomy constituting a field of possible manifestations of fascist or fascistic trends is quite useful for a researcher of comparative global political and ideological movements and their transnational dispersion. This approach is the opposite of what proponents of the Islamofascism paradigm are seeking. They differ in turn from researchers who only accept European manifestations of fascism as truly fascist and consider equivalent non-European groups and parties as performing mere mimicry. Instead, the proponents of Islamofascism use shallow evidence of personal context and a superficial assessment of representations to extend the fascist epithet to politicized Muslims, with the intention to denigrate them as indistinct from fascism or Nazism's rigorous ideological systems and forms of political practice and extreme violence. Even Eurocentric fascism theory offers, in spite of its weaknesses, a way to react to this assertion. Islamofascism's conflation of modern Islamism and fascism suggests that both would share an ideological core. On the level of abstraction that theorists like Griffin, Eatwell, and Sternhill apply, this essential core would have to be the negation of humanist reasoning and the rejection of the Enlightenment. It is arguable, though, that the origins of modern Islamism are precisely the opposite. They do not lie in the rejection of reason and science, but in debates about Islamic reform of the 19th century and their engagement with reason and science. It would be a matter of debate whether the militant, radical, and murderous manifestations of Islamism today are simply aberrations and hence accidental and not essential characteristics of modern Islamism, or if they are symptomatic for a digression into a darker terrain that Islamism entered in the 1960s or so. Again, that's a whole separate issue, but I don't agree with everything expressed in this article. 19th century reformers such as Rifa'i al-Tatawi, Khair al-Din al-Tunisi, and Muhammad Abduh, but also for 20th century figures like Rashid Rida and Abdul Hamid Ben Badis, tried to reconcile the achievements of the European Age of Reason with the Islamic heritage. Their agenda was to protect the Islamic community against superstition and to claim science and reason for an alternative Islamic modernity. In the late 1930s, Hassan al-Banna, the Muslim Brotherhood's founder, rejected fascism explicitly, as well as nationalism and racism raging in Europe, including the persecution of the Jews by the Nazis. Thus, he wanted to present the Muslims of his organization as not only on par with Europeans, but even as morally superior. If mass organization, fascist style, and the cult of violence are accidental to fascism, as Eatwell argues, and the same would apply to the extreme manifestations of political Islam in violence and rhetoric. Consequently, fascism and Islamism would be essentially different in the core. The former rejects, and the latter endorses reason. On a different note, there is also no similarity between Islamism and clerico-fascism of the extreme right in Catholic countries, as the shared religious reference might suggest. Clerico-fascism represented an alignment between fascist movements and the institutional church. The origins of modern Islamism are, however, in a movement that opposed the religious establishment of Muslim countries, which was perceived as inflexible and hostile to rationality. So I find that interesting. Like, you know, I guess it is a bit theoretical. However, like I just think it's very broadly applicable. It's very important and like just an interesting point to me about like the intellectual culture of the Arab world, like in its relationship to fascism in this particular period, like in the lead up to World War II and how it changed afterwards. But it's also like more broadly applicable in terms of how like we think about fascism as a phenomenon, like both in the contemporary U.S. and also like in you know, Israel today and in the past. You know, like
absolutely,
yeah. So
yeah, and the idea of like the rejection of enlightenment, that is an interesting litmus test, especially today, for like whether something should be called properly fascist or not. You know, because we have a new term for that that's sloshing around right now. You know, the dark enlightenment that people very close to the new U.S. administration have been pushing for years. And
well, insofar as that's like a Moldbug thing, Moldbug is definitely like a counter. I would describe him as like a counter Enlightenment thinker, insofar as he's a thinker at all. You know, like, but what I think is interesting in this is that the, you know, like there's sort of this hand-wringing in terms of like, you know, people like Elon or whatever. You know, I remember with regards to the Nazi salute, he like made some tweet that was like, people think I'm a Zionist and a Nazi, or like even the way that people conceive of Nazism, like it's impossible for someone to be like a fascist and a Zionist, or like it seems inherently kind of like anti-Semitic or whatever to make this comparison. Right. Now, like we can obviously look at like the historical relationships, like as we did in the earlier part, but also like if the term fascist is going to be like useful and not just describe like those two very specific historical phenomena, or you know, only make sense in a European context, you know, we need to like come up with some other type of framework for talking about it. And the phenomenological one that he suggests is interesting, you know. And I think that I'm partial to phenomenology in general, like maybe not in the way that he's using it, but I think that is valuable. And I also, you know, I think that it is like separately interesting that like in a, you know, how differently these ideas like were received. And like again, I do agree that it's a very superficial thing how they were kind of processed in the Arab world, because that fundamental thing, like I was thinking about this the other day, like I was thinking about the novel Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, you know, and how there's kind of like a romantic element of that, like you know, where the kindly bishop, you know, helps Jean Valjean. There's kind of this complex attitude, like whereas like the sort of Arab literature of the 20th century, you know, sorry, not the 20th century, the 19th century, certainly, and the early 20th century, you know, the so-called like Arab Renaissance, the Nete, like it's usually the themes are like maybe the, you know, too much of a generalization, but there's not really like a romanticist strain in it, you know. There's not really that strain of like the reaction to the Enlightenment or anything like that, or like
wanting
a
to
desire to
return with
re-enchant. Right. It's the opposite. You know, it's kind of reckoning with the sort of imposition of this rationalist social order, you know, and often it's kind of, like as it talks about in terms of Islamism itself, which like not necessarily like, you know, was a big strain in the literary movement that I'm talking about now, but it often was kind of posing traditionalist religious organizations or sort of old ways and kind of siding with an idea of, you know, enlightenment or a renaissance or
rejuvenation,
you know,
of
taking things from the West.
Right.
So,
yeah. There's different like relational contexts of, absolutely, because they were still in the late Ottoman period, you know, at that time, and They were operating in a different context. But I think, everything we've gone over today definitely shows that, like Nazi and a Zionist, are you crazy? It's like, well,
Yeah.
Like,
well, I mean, it just shows like how cartoonish the sort of popular discourse of these things are and how disconnected they are from like history and the reality of it.
Right.
But
right.
Yeah.
I mean, you could even say Zionism is at its core is a European movement. Is much more caught up in all this like Blutenboden, like romantic nationalism shit. Than their Arab counterparts.
Interesting to consider that. Like,
I mean, it's literally like the culture that like all of them kind of come out of, whether it's like British culture, German culture, the Russian Empire. Like, it's pretty much that's literally where the quote unquote civilization they all came out of.
Like the fascist characteristics of Zionism now, like.
Yeah. And in fact, I guess, it really has always been there. And
from the very beginning. Yeah, there's a.
And, I mean, honestly, it's like if the Nazis hadn't been anti-Semitic the way they were, there was not much like separating a lot of the Zionists politically from kind of agreeing with them in a lot of ways. But I mean, of course, they were kind of like separate. They advocated a kind of separatism. I downloaded Jabotinsky's 1926 novel, Samson, which is sort of like a futuristic fantasia about like a future sort of Palestine. It's my understanding that gets pretty damn fascist throughout. Yeah, this has definitely been, it has been a current, and on the one hand, downplaying like the threat of fascism, thinking it's good and everything else. Like, I mean, the Zionist movement does not acquit itself super well, I think, in this period. And a lot of this got kind of laundered because the Nazis then did end up murdering millions of Jews, and the Zionist role in that got kind of like forgotten, became kind of a secondary thing. And then they were on to the next tactical move of then saying, well, we need a state now. Obviously, we need a state. But some of these guys were very cynically playing with fire, right? As Edward Bernays kind of warned them, like you're making deals with them, you're sitting back and, not joining boycotts, you're not resisting. And this is truly a case of like, if you do not resist, then you need to do resistance. Because that was real fascism. But I don't know. There is a disturbing kind of alignment in not just interest, but vibes between a lot of the 1930s Zionists. And like, they're all too comfortable with these romantic nationalist and like race-based visions of what a great society should be. And the SS, I guess, up to a point really agreed with it and loved it. So yeah, I think next time we'll get into the Arab Revolt proper. I think next time, because a lot of shit happens. There's more Zionist intrigues, more terrorism. You see the actual on the ground fascism of Zionist groups like the Haganah and other groups like start to come to a fore here, right? During the Arab Revolt, but we will, we'll pick that up soon. But until then, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.